Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket a little tighter, dim the screen down if you need to. Tonight we are going somewhere very specific into the back rooms and locked filing cabinets of one of the most controversial animated shows ever made. We are talking about Family Guy, and not the version you usually discuss. We are talking about the episodes that never made it to your television screen, the storylines that got buried, the jokes that were cut before anyone could see them, and the mysteries that the writers either could not or would not ever fully explain. This is a long one, so settle in because we are just getting started. Section 1. The first episode. Fox refused to air When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. There is a version of Family Guy's history where the show almost never recovered from its third season. By the time Fox aired what it considered the last episode of that original run in early 2002, the show had been canceled, shuffled across the schedule, and treated like something the network had no idea what to do with. The writers, the crew, the voice cast, everyone involved had basically been told that the show was finished. And somewhere in the wreckage of that cancellation, a completed episode sat on a shelf, fully animated, fully voiced, ready to go. And Fox would not put it on the air. The episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it had been produced back in the year 2000 as part of what was supposed to be the second season. It was ready to air as a holiday special around Hanukkah of that year. The story followed Peter Griffin in a situation that was classic early Family Guy. He had been scammed out of the family's emergency savings by a con man selling volcano insurance. For the people of Rhode Island, this is not a product anyone needs. Peter, being Peter, had bought it without a second thought. Now broke and desperate, he needed help getting the money back. And the way the episode sets it up is both genuinely funny and deliberately uncomfortable at the same time, which is exactly the tone the show was going for in those early seasons. Peter overhears Quagmire and Cleveland talking about how they have both had better financial outcomes when working with people who had Jewish-sounding names. And Peter, in his endlessly misguided way, decides that what he needs in his life is a Jewish friend. He does not want one because he admires Jewish culture or wants to broaden his understanding of the world. He wants one because he has absorbed the stereotype that Jewish people are good with money, and he needs money help. The entire premise is built on exposing how ridiculous and harmful that kind of thinking is, with Peter's denseness serving as the vehicle for the satire. He prays out loud for the universe to send him a Jewish person. And then, in a remarkable bit of timing, a man named Max Weinstein shows up outside the Griffin house with car trouble. What follows is a fairly warm and sweet storyline. Max, voiced by actor Peter Riegert, is a patient, decent person who helps Peter track down the scam artist and recover the family's money. He is not a caricature. He is a genuine character who just happens to be Jewish, and the show treats him with real dignity. But Peter, having decided that the key to all of life's problems is Jewish wisdom and Jewish financial advice, then gets the idea to convert his son Chris to Judaism. He takes Chris to Las Vegas for a bar mitzvah ceremony. Lois chases them across 2 days by car and then on foot. The episode ends with Peter understanding, properly this time, that success in life has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with hard work and honesty. On the DVD commentary, Seth MacFarlane mentioned that he had shown the script to 2 rabbis before production began. Both of them approved it. They felt the episode made the right point in the end, that stereotyping is stupid, and Peter's prejudice, however well-intentioned in his twisted mind, was still prejudice. MacFarlane also noted that roughly 70% of the show's writing staff was Jewish, including Ricky Blitt, who actually wrote this particular episode. The episode was also not exactly subtle about the fact that its jokes were aimed at the people who believe these stereotypes, not the people the stereotypes are about. Peter is the target of the comedy, not Max Weinstein. None of that mattered to Fox executives, who looked at the episode and decided they could not risk it. Their concern was that audiences would not understand the satirical intent and would just come away thinking Family Guy had made an anti-Semitic episode. And there is something genuinely strange about that reasoning, because the entire point of the episode and the entire point of Peter Griffin as a character in those early seasons was that his misguided ideas are always exposed as misguided by the end of the story. The joke is on Peter. It was always on Peter. But Fox saw the ingredients of the episode before they saw the finished meal and decided not to serve it at all. So the episode sat. 1999 became 2000, which became 2001, and then the show was canceled. The episode that had been sitting in the vault suddenly had nowhere to go, even if Fox had changed its mind. It was not until September of 2003, 3 full years after it was produced and completed, that When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was finally released, first as part of the Season 3 DVD box set, and then in November of that same year on Adult Swim's late night block. Seth MacFarlane himself recorded a special introduction for the Adult Swim airing, where he played it straight while being deliberately funny about the situation. He announced it as the episode that Fox refused to show and explained it was centered on Peter Griffin's misconceptions of the Jewish community, which was about as clearly as you can signal to an audience. That the whole point is that Peter is wrong. Fox finally aired their own censored version of the episode in December of 2004, more than 4 years after it had been made. And when it aired on Fox, there was one specific lyric in Peter's big musical number that had been changed. During the episode, Peter sings a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star from the old Disney animated film Pinocchio, which he titles I Need a Jew. On the original DVD version, one of the lines in the song included the phrase, even though they killed my lord. Fox changed that line to, I don't think they killed my lord for broadcast, softening a theological joke that had been in the episode all along. The original line, in context, is another example of Peter's confused and self-contradictory thinking. He is simultaneously holding an anti-Semitic belief and rejecting it within the span of a single song. But Fox was not willing to broadcast that nuance. The song itself became the subject of a lawsuit a few years later. In 2007, a music publisher called Born Company, the sole owner of the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox, Seth MacFarlane, several Fox subsidiaries, and Cartoon Network, claiming that I Need a Jew was not a legitimate parody, but an infringement on their copyright. Their argument was that the song was too close to the original, and that associating their cherished piece of intellectual property with the word Jew and lyrics about religious stereotyping had caused harm to its value. The case went to a federal judge. In March of 2009, U.S. District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy and Fox, finding that I Need a Jew was indeed a clear parody, protected under the fair use doctrine. Born Company lost. What makes this whole story worth dwelling on is the texture of what happened. Fox sat on a completed, animated, fully voice-acted episode for 4 years because they were afraid of how the audience might misinterpret it. They eventually aired it anyway, with modifications, after the show had come back from the dead and re-established itself with a huge fan base. The episode, when people finally saw it, was generally received as a decent and fairly clever installment. Most viewers agreed it was not actually anti-Semitic. A few critics noted it had not aged perfectly but found it tame compared to what the show would later do. The rabbis who had pre-approved the script were not mentioned in any of the controversy, and the whole incident was quietly absorbed into the mythology of the show as one of the things Family Guy had managed to survive. It would not be the last time Fox had this kind of fight with its own programming. The next episode that landed in this same kind of trouble would be far more permanent in its banishment and far more divisive in the reactions it produced. Drop a comment below and let me know where are you watching from tonight and what time is it there? And if you are enjoying this, please subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this kind of content going for everyone who comes here to wind down. Section 2. The only episode that never aired in America, Partial Terms of Endearment. There is a difference between an episode being controversial and an episode being completely forbidden. Most of the episodes in Family Guy's history that generated controversy were controversial because of how they handled their subject matter too crude, too blunt, too close to a real event, or too willing to say a thing that made people uncomfortable. But they still aired. They still reached their audience, generated their ratings, and became part of the cultural record of the show, for better or worse. Partial Terms of Endearment is a different category entirely. This episode, the intended finale of the show's 8th season, was completed, fully produced, voice-acted, animated, and ready for broadcast in 2010. And Fox looked at it and said no. Not, let's hold this for a better time slot. Not, let's make some edits and try again. Just no. And when Adult Swim expressed interest in possibly airing it, Fox asked them not to. This is the only episode in the entire run of Family Guy that has never aired on American television in any form, by any network, under any circumstances. As of the time this script was written, it remains in that exact same position. The episode was announced publicly before it ever aired. At San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, the Family Guy team told the audience about what was coming in Season 8 and mentioned that the season finale would deal with the subject of abortion. The crowd reacted with the mixture of excitement and dread that the show had come to generate in its audience, this combination of, oh no, they are really going to go there, and of course they are going to go there. Seth MacFarlane was present and described the episode's approach as similar to the way films like Airplane handled heavy subject matter, taking something serious and treating it with sharp, irreverent comedy that doesn't arrive at a political conclusion but does force the audience to think about the subject in a different way. The story works like this. An old college friend of Lois's named Naomi visits the Griffin family. Naomi and her husband Dale have been trying to have a child for years and have not been able to conceive on their own. Naomi approaches Lois and asks her if she would consider being a surrogate mother for them. Lois, after some deliberation, agrees. Peter objects immediately. He does not want his wife carrying someone else's child, and he reacts to the whole situation with the kind of clumsy, wrong-headed resistance that Peter Griffin is designed to produce. The surrogacy begins, and then tragedy strikes. Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois pregnant with a child that now has no biological family waiting for it. What happens next is the core of the episode and the reason Fox refused to air it. Lois is faced with a decision that the show does not soften or deflect. She can carry the pregnancy to term and put the baby up for adoption, or she can have an abortion. Peter, in one of the episode's sharpest satirical moves, gets swept up by an anti-abortion protest and becomes convinced that abortion is murder. He joins the protesters and starts carrying signs. He watches an anti-abortion video narrated by actor Wil Wheaton that depicts the procedure in deliberately graphic and manipulative terms, and the episode makes it clear that this video is designed to manipulate, not to inform. Peter becomes radicalized in about 48 hours, which is entirely consistent with who Peter Griffin is. He has always been susceptible to the most recent thing someone told him with conviction. Lois, meanwhile, is genuinely wrestling with the decision. The episode gives her real weight to carry. She does not arrive at a conclusion quickly. She thinks about it. She talks to Peter. She considers what her values are and what she believes. And at the very end of the episode, after all of that deliberation, the show delivers its punchline. The Griffin family is sitting around the dinner table and Lois mentions the wonderful new member of the Griffin family. Before she can say another word, Peter looks directly at the camera, breaks the fourth wall completely, and says, "We had the abortion." And the episode ends. That moment is the show at its most brazenly self-aware. Peter's line does not tell the audience how to feel about abortion. It does not make a political statement about whether the decision was right or wrong. It simply acknowledges that a decision was made and refuses to dramatize it any further, which is, in some ways, the most honest response a show like this can offer. MacFarlane compared the episode's approach to a 1,972 episode of the show Maude the B. Arthur comedy, in which Maude's character discovered she was pregnant at 47 and spent 2 episodes trying to decide whether to have an abortion. Those Maude episodes were extraordinarily controversial for their time and aired just 2 months before Roe v. Wade. MacFarlane felt he was working in that same tradition, using comedy to force a conversation rather than to deliver a verdict. Fox disagreed. Their position was not that the episode made a specific political argument they objected to. Their position was that the subject itself was too hot to touch in 2010, that abortion as a topic was surrounded by enough anger and organized protest movements, that airing an episode about it on a mainstream network would generate a firestorm from multiple directions simultaneously. Pro-choice groups might object to Peter's conversion to the anti-abortion position, however temporary and satirical. Anti-abortion groups would object to the episode's ending. Advertisers would pull their spots. Affiliates in certain markets might refuse to carry it. The calculation was purely financial, as it almost always is in these situations. MacFarlane acknowledged in an interview with the New York Times that Fox's calculation was probably correct. He told them, "I've got to believe that if this were an episode of House, it probably would have aired." The point being that a drama with a comparable storyline would have been treated differently than an adult animated comedy because the perception of the format of cartoon made the subject matter seem more transgressive than it would have been in live action. The joke exists in the same space as the serious subject, and for some audiences, the joke undermines the seriousness. For others, the joke is what makes the seriousness bearable. McFarlane believed the second group was right. Fox believed the first group was louder. The episode was released on DVD in Region 1 on the 28th of September 2010. The BBC in the United Kingdom aired it on the 20th of June 2010, in its usual primetime slot, and approximately 1 million households in Britain watched it. It was later aired in Australia in April of 2011 and in the Netherlands in August of that year. The episode has also been available on some international streaming platforms. But in the United States, where Family Guy was made, where it airs, and where most of its audience lives, it has never once appeared on a television screen. It is not available on Hulu, which is the primary streaming home of the American version of Family Guy. It was not included when Family Guy was added to Disney's streaming services. Its absence from every American platform is total and unbroken. There is something philosophically interesting about an episode so controversial it cannot even be shown in the country that made it, but which airs perfectly normally in several others. It tells you something about how American broadcast television has always been simultaneously more permissive and more restrictive than television in most other parts of the world. Permissive with violence and crude humor, restrictive with anything touching political flashpoints. The British broadcasters who aired partial terms of endearment were not doing anything brave. They were just doing what broadcasters in most of the world do, which is treating their adult audience as capable of watching a comedy episode about a difficult subject without requiring the government or a network to protect them from it. McFarlane's own feelings about the ban were nuanced. He was frustrated, clearly. But he also seemed to understand that Fox had made a rational, if cowardly, business decision. He never pushed very hard in public for the episode to be released in America. He moved on, and Partial Terms of Endearment became a piece of Family Guy lore, the episode that exists, that has been seen by audiences in multiple countries, that received decent reviews from those who watched it, and that remains legally, officially, permanently absent from the American television landscape. What it leaves behind is a question worth sitting with. If the episode is not good enough to air, if its content is genuinely too harmful, why is it available on DVD and viewable through various means by anyone who looks for it? And if it is good enough, if it is, as many who saw it argued, a sharp and honest piece of comedy that handles its subject with more care than cynicism, then what exactly is being protected by keeping it off American television? The answer is probably not the audience. The answer is probably not taste standards or decency. The answer, as it almost always is when broadcast television refuses to air something, is the money. The advertisements, the affiliates, the corporate structure that surrounds the show and has always had more to say about what gets aired than the people who actually make it. The episode that Fox was willing to make but not willing to show, the episode that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. If you have seen it, you know it is not the apocalyptic provocation that its reputation suggests. If you have not seen it, the reputation is probably more interesting than the episode itself, which might be exactly the point. Section 3. The episode that touched a real tragedy. Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon. There are two very different kinds of banned Family Guy episodes. There is the kind that gets banned because of its subject matter, because the show chose to write about something that the network or the culture decided could not be handled as comedy. And then there is the kind that gets banned because of timing. Because an episode that was written, animated, and aired under completely normal circumstances suddenly found itself existing in a world where a real event had made its fictional content feel unbearable to watch. Turban Cowboy is the second kind. It aired on Fox on the 17th of March 2013 as the 16th episode of the show's 11th season. On the night it aired, it was watched by nearly 5 million people and received the highest ratings of Fox's animation block that Sunday. The critics were not impressed. One reviewer from the AV Club gave it a D and described it as feeling like an episode written a decade earlier and left forgotten on a shelf, but the ratings were solid. Nothing happened that night that suggested this episode would become anything other than another forgettable mid-season installment of a long-running animated comedy. About 4.5 weeks later, on the 15th of April, 2013, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. More than 260 were injured. The images from that day of runners falling, of bystanders scrambling, of smoke rising over Boylston Street went around the world in minutes. It was one of the most devastating terrorist attacks on American soil since the events of the 11th of September 2001. And somewhere in the shock and grief of the days that followed, someone made an edit. Here is what happened. The Turban Cowboy episode contained two things that suddenly became horribly resonant. The first was a cutaway gag in which Peter Griffin is asked by sportscaster Bob Costas about his performance in the Boston Marathon. A flashback then shows Peter winning the race by driving his car through the crowd, hitting other runners with the vehicle as he goes. The second was a separate scene in which Peter, having befriended a man who turns out to be a terrorist, accidentally triggers a series of explosions using a cell phone. These two scenes existed in completely different parts of the episode, separated by several minutes and several narrative beats. They had nothing to do with each other in the context of the story. But someone took a clip of the first scene, edited it together with a clip of the second scene, and posted the combination to YouTube as if the episode had depicted a bombing at the Boston Marathon that was triggered by a cell phone. This edited clip was then shared by Alex Jones on his InfoWars platform and Twitter, accompanied by claims that the episode had somehow predicted or inspired the real bombing. Seth MacFarlane responded quickly and with visible fury. He posted on Twitter that same day, "The edited Family Guy clip currently circulating is abhorrent. The event was a crime and a tragedy, and my thoughts are with the victims." He was not defending the episode as timely or tasteful. He was defending reality, specifically the reality that the two scenes being stitched together in that viral clip had nothing to do with each other, and that suggesting Family Guy had somehow foreshadowed or inspired a terrorist attack was not just wrong but deeply irresponsible. YouTube worked to remove the edited clip. The hoax was eventually debunked, but it had already spread far enough to make news. Fox moved quickly. Within hours of the bombing and before the full extent of the conspiracy theory video had even spread, the network pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com and from Hulu. The episode disappeared from both platforms that same day. Fox stated publicly that it had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. It was effectively removed from existence as far as American streaming and broadcast were concerned. The pulling of the episode raised legitimate questions about what was actually being addressed. The conspiracy theory about the episode predicting the bombing was obviously false and was already being dismissed. But the underlying issue that an episode containing a scene of mass violence at the Boston Marathon had aired approximately a month before mass violence at the Boston Marathon was real and uncomfortable, regardless of the conspiracy angle. The episode in its original airing had contained that cutaway of Peter driving through marathon runners without any particular concern for what it was depicting. It was cartoon violence of the most disposable kind. The sort of gag that Family Guy had been producing for years, a quick, ugly joke that existed purely for shock value and was forgotten by the time the next scene began. In context of the April bombings, it became something different. Not because it had caused anything, but because it now existed alongside something real. The episode stayed off American platforms for nearly a decade. It was finally returned to Hulu in September of 2022, more than 9 years after it had been removed. Its return received minimal attention, partly because by 2022, the show had moved on through many more seasons and the episode itself was hardly a landmark in the show's history. The critics who had reviewed it in 2013 were right that it was not a particularly good episode. The main plot, in which Peter befriends a Muslim man named Mahmoud who turns out to be a terrorist, was criticized even before the bombing controversy for being Islamophobic in the way it depicted its Muslim character, presenting a Muslim person's friendship with Peter as inherently suspicious and then validating that suspicion by having Mahmoud actually be a terrorist in the end. The subplot had been called out for reinforcing exactly the kind of prejudice it seemed to be trying to satirize. The irony of Turban Cowboy is that it became famous entirely because of the conspiracy theory and the timing, two things that had nothing to do with the quality or intent of the episode itself. It was not a good episode that got unfairly caught up in tragedy. It was a mediocre episode that found itself at the center of a completely false story about its connection to a real tragedy. And the result was that it spent 9 years absent from American platforms, returning quietly and without ceremony in a way that suggested nobody was particularly pleased about having to deal with it. What stays with you about this story is the speed of it. Fox pulled the episode within hours of the bombing. The conspiracy video was already circulating and already false. Nobody at Fox sat down and said, "This episode is actually problematic. Let us reconsider it." They said, "This episode is near something extremely painful right now, and we need it gone." That is a different kind of decision than the one made about partial terms of endearment, where the refusal to air was about the content itself. This was about proximity, about the unbearable feeling of watching a cartoon joke and then thinking of real people on Boylston Street. That feeling is not irrational, and the response to it removing the episode was not irrational either. It just had very little to do with whether the episode deserved to exist. Section 4. The episode that could not find its tone, screams of silence and the domestic abuse problem. Among all of Family Guy's controversial episodes, there is one that generates a specific kind of discomfort that is different from all the others. The banned episodes and the pulled episodes are controversial because of external factors, a network's fear of backlash, a real-world tragedy, a political topic too hot to touch. This episode is controversial because of what it tried to do and how completely it failed to do it. It is not an episode that got punished for being brave. It is an episode that got justly criticized for being confused, hypocritical, and genuinely harmful in its messaging, despite having started from a place of good intentions. Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q aired on the 30th of October 2011 as the third episode of the show's 10th season. It was written by Alex Sulkin, who was one of the show's executive producers, and directed by Dominic Bianchi. It was not banned. It was not pulled from broadcast. It aired, received immediate and sustained critical hostility, and has lived ever since in a kind of infamy that is different from the episodes Fox refused to show, because this one aired and did its damage in full view of everyone watching. The setup begins with Quagmire nearly dying at home from a practice called autoerotic asphyxiation, which is already a signal about where the episode's tonal judgment sits. His sister Brenda arrives at the hospital to help revive him, and she brings along her boyfriend Jeff. Jeff is an abuser. From the moment he appears on screen, the episode presents him beating and belittling Brenda in ways that are explicit, direct, and unambiguously horrible. Brenda has a bruised eye. She has a splinted finger that she explains by saying it fell down the stairs. She defends Jeff to Lois when Lois tries to help her see what is happening. Everything about the way Brenda is written is meant to reflect the real psychological dynamics of abuse, the denial, the self-blame, the attachment to someone who causes harm. And on paper, that sounds like the makings of an honest, uncomfortable episode. The problem is that the show surrounding those dynamics is Family Guy, and the characters delivering the concern and the eventual rescue are Peter Griffin, Joe Swanson, and Glenn Quagmire. These are three men who, across many seasons of the show, have collectively committed an extraordinary number of offenses against the women in their lives. Peter has been emotionally and physically abusive toward his own daughter, Meg, for years. Presented as comedy, Joe, as a police officer, fails to act to protect Brenda throughout most of the episode until the violence escalates beyond what he can legally ignore. And Quagmire, the man who is supposed to be the hero of this story, the protective brother who will not stand by and watch his sister be hurt, is a character whose relationship with women throughout the show's entire history has been built on a foundation of rape jokes, sexual coercion, and treating women as objects for his own gratification. The episode is aware of this. It cannot possibly be unaware of it. And yet it proceeds anyway, making Quagmire the moral center of the story, the person who tells Brenda that she deserves better, who tells her she is strong and valuable and should not accept this treatment. Coming from Glenn Quagmire, these lines do not land the way they were intended. They land as something close to the opposite of what was intended. A character who has spent years being one of the most explicit examples of how this show treats women badly is now lecturing his sister about how she deserves to be treated well. The hypocrisy is not subtle, but the episode's most criticized moment is not Quagmire's hypocrisy. It is a scene involving Brenda's intervention, in which Quagmire tells Brenda that she does not deserve to be called a woman because she continues to stay with someone who abuses her. The intention behind this line is presumably to express Quagmire's frustration and his sense that Brenda is not valuing herself. But what it communicates clearly, unmistakably, is that victims of domestic abuse who stay with their abusers are somehow lesser, that they have forfeited something by not leaving, that the failure to escape is a reflection of their character or their worth. This is victim blaming in one of its most direct forms, and the episode presents it as a moment of passionate, heroic honesty from Quagmire. Critics and advocates working in domestic violence education responded with consistent and justified criticism. The episode's portrayal of why people stay with abusers reduces an enormously complex psychological reality to something the show treats as inexplicable and almost contemptible. The real dynamics of abusive relationships, the cycle of violence and tenderness, the financial dependency, the erosion of self-worth over time, the fear of what leaving might bring are nowhere in the episode. Brenda makes excuses for Jeff because the show needs her to make excuses for Jeff so that the audience finds the situation extreme enough to root for Quagmire's rescue mission. She is not written as a real person navigating an impossibly difficult situation. She is written as a setup for the plot. The resolution of the episode makes things worse rather than better. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire lure Jeff on a hunting trip under the pretense of friendship, intending to kill him and make it look like an accident. Jeff anticipates this and tries to turn the tables, but Quagmire ultimately runs him over with a car and kills him. The three men then return to Brenda and present her with a forged note from Jeff, claiming he has decided to leave her. They do not tell her he is dead. They do not give her any actual information about what happened. They kill her abuser, conceal it from her, and hand her a piece of paper designed to make her feel that the man who spent years hurting her has simply walked away. The episode presents this as a satisfying conclusion. One reviewer from the AV Club noted that the episode cripples the show's strengths by attempting seriousness in a format built on irreverence, and then failing at both the seriousness and the irreverence simultaneously. Another critic noted that the episode's message, unintentionally but clearly, was that the correct response to domestic abuse is for the men in a woman's life to handle it on her behalf and then withhold information from her about what they have done. Brenda ends the episode having been rescued from an abuser but denied the truth, denied any agency in her own situation, and left grieving what she thinks is an abandonment rather than knowing she is safe. The episode received strong acting from Caitlin Olsen, who voiced Brenda with real commitment and found emotional truth in the character even when the writing around her was failing. Olsen is best known for her work on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where she plays a character who frequently exists in states of chaos and delusion, but the difference between what Always Sunny does with that kind of character and what Family Guy does here is enormous. Always Sunny is built on the premise that all of its characters are terrible people, and the show never lets them escape that. Family Guy wanted to use characters who are frequently terrible for an episode about something genuinely painful, and the mismatch between the characters' histories and the story's demands was too large to bridge. What makes Screams of Silence worth spending time on is what it reveals about a fundamental limitation in what Family Guy could do in its middle and later seasons. The show had, in the past, produced episodes of genuine emotional weight episodes where the comedy stepped back and something real happened between characters. But those episodes worked because they emerged naturally from the characters as they had been established. The Bank Vault episode, where Brian and Stewie spend an entire episode just talking to each other, works because those two characters have a real dynamic with real history. Screams of Silence fails because it takes characters who have specific, problematic histories with exactly the subject matter at hand and pretends those histories do not exist. The episode aired. It was not banned. It was not pulled. And in some ways, that makes it more troubling than the episodes that never reached an audience. Because this one reached its audience, delivered its confused and damaging message, and then moved on, leaving behind a reputation as one of the worst things the show had ever done, not because of Fox's interference, not because of a real-world tragedy, but because the people who made it either did not understand what they were saying or did not care. Section 5. The storylines that got buried lost cuts, shelved ideas, and scenes you never saw. Not every Family Guy controversy arrived with a full episode attached to it. Some of the most interesting moments in the show's history are the ones that never made it to any episode at all, the ideas that were pitched, developed, and then quietly set aside. The scenes that were animated and then cut before broadcast. The cutaway gags that disappeared between the production draft and the final edit. the storylines that existed long enough to be discussed publicly before being abandoned for reasons that were never fully explained. Start with the uncensored versions of episodes that casual viewers have never encountered. The first episode of the show ever produced, Death Has a Shadow, aired on the 31st of January 1999 and contained a cutaway gag that has since become famous in the show's history. In this scene, Stewie distracts airport security by performing a song and dance routine singing "On the Good Ship Lollipop" while his weapons slip through the baggage screening undetected. The gag then cuts to a parallel scene where Osama bin Laden is attempting to use the same tactic at a different airport, singing a different song to similar effect. This was a joke written and animated in the year 1999, when bin Laden was a known international terrorist, but before September 11 had made him something else entirely. The joke existed in the weird space where terrorism was a real threat that American culture had not yet experienced with full, immediate horror. After the 11th of September 2001, the scene was removed. It was cut from the episode's rerun schedule, cut from the version included in the early DVD releases, and essentially erased from the broadcast version of the episode. For years, viewers who had only seen the show on Fox or Adult Swim had no idea the scene existed. It was eventually restored to some streaming versions of the episode and can now be seen in certain places, but for a significant stretch of the show's history, it was simply absent a ghost scene from a world before the world changed. There were other cuts that were less dramatic but equally instructive about where the show's boundaries were being drawn in real time. In Road to Rhode Island, the original production of the episode included a version of the scene where Brian and Stewie enter the Griffin living room to find Peter and Lois together on the couch. In the broadcast version, the couple is wearing underwear. In the uncensored version included on DVD, both are completely nude, and Lois delivers additional dialogue of a distinctly adult nature. This was not a change made for broadcast decency standards, or rather, it was, but the decency standards in question were about nudity, rather than about any particular controversy with the content. The DVD version restored what had been shot, which was apparently what the writers considered the funnier version. There is also the matter of specific cutaway gags that appeared in production scripts and animatics, but were cut before the episodes reached their final form. The show's writing process involves multiple stages of development, and jokes that seem viable in the writer's room sometimes do not survive contact with the animatic review process, network note sessions, or the simple fact of how they land when you actually hear them performed. The Family Guy Fanon Wiki maintains an extraordinarily detailed catalog of these changes, scene by scene, line by line, across most of the show's seasons, and the scope of what has been cut, altered, or softened over the years is remarkable. Individual lines about everything from the Kennedy assassinations to explicit sexual acts to references to real people's private lives were removed at various points in production. One category of cuts deserves particular attention: the scenes that were changed specifically because of Disney's acquisition of Fox in 2019. When Disney became the corporate parent of Fox and therefore of Family Guy, certain content became newly complicated. The show had for years included jokes, references, and visual gags involving Disney characters and properties, material that ranged from gentle parody to outright mockery. After the acquisition, some of this material required new conversations. The Disney Plus streaming platform launched in 2019 with Family Guy available, but with specific episodes absent or specific scenes trimmed. The most notable of these was Partial Terms of Endearment, which remained off Disney Plus entirely, consistent with its absence from all American streaming platforms. But beyond the Disney complication, there were storyline ideas that never made it past the development stage in the writer's room. The show's writers have occasionally discussed these publicly, though usually with vague references rather than specific details. One that has been confirmed involved a planned storyline connected to the Me Too movement, centered on Quagmire, a character whose relationship with women has always been at the center of the show's most troubling humor. The idea, apparently, was to address the Quagmire character's history in a way that connected to the broader cultural conversation about sexual misconduct and accountability that defined much of 2017 and 2018. For reasons that were never publicly explained, this episode was never made. It existed long enough to be described in interviews, but not long enough to reach production. Given what the show did with Quagmire throughout its run, the running jokes about his sexual behavior that ranged from crude to genuinely disturbing, The episode where he is presented as violent but then asked to be heroic in Screams of Silence. The way his character was simultaneously used as a comic vehicle and occasionally as a moral voice. An episode directly addressing all of that might have been extraordinary. It might also have been a disaster. The fact that it was considered and then not made suggests that somewhere in the decision chain, someone understood that actually following through on the implications of Quagmire's history would require a level of self-examination the show had never been willing to apply to itself. There is also the matter of the show's handling of scenes involving real political figures that were altered or removed depending on when they were set to air. Episodes touching on specific politicians' jokes about George W. Bush were common in the early seasons. Barack Obama appeared in various contexts, and Donald Trump was both the subject of jokes and briefly a character in a cutaway sequence were sometimes softened or altered between production and broadcast, depending on the political climate at the time. Some of these changes were minor. Others involved removing or replacing specific references that had become more sensitive between the time the episode was written and the time it aired. This is not unique to Family Guy. All political satire on television operates under the awareness that the world can change between a joke being written and that joke being broadcast. But the speed with which the show's writers produced episodes meant that the gap between writing and airing was often shorter than on other programs, and the risk of a joke aging badly before it even appeared was correspondingly higher. What you end up with, when you look at all of these cuts and changes and buried ideas together, is a picture of a show that was in constant negotiation with the world around it, with the network, with the corporate parent, with the political climate, with the audience's recent experience of tragedy, with its own history and the implications of that history. Some of those negotiations produced the right outcome, some produced the wrong one, and some produced nothing at all, just an idea that got far enough to be interesting before disappearing without explanation, leaving behind only the faint outline of what might have been. Section 6. The Luckiest Hangover in History. Seth MacFarlane, September 11, and What Almost Was. The story of Seth MacFarlane's connection to the events of the 11th of September 2001 is one of the most remarkable biographical footnotes in the history of television. It is also genuinely strange to think about, not in a supernatural way, not in a way that suggests fate or purpose, but in the very ordinary, vertiginous way that proximity to disaster can feel when the disaster itself is something you missed by the smallest possible margin. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to fly from Boston to Los Angeles on American Airlines Flight 11. This is a matter of public record. MacFarlane confirmed it in interviews, most notably in an appearance on The Howard Stern Show in 2009. He had been in Rhode Island the previous night, giving a lecture at the Rhode Island School of Design, his alma mater, the same school where he had developed the concepts that became Family Guy. After the lecture, he went out for drinks with friends. He stayed out too late. He woke up the next morning with a proper hangover. And then his travel agent, separately and without any connection to the drinking, gave him the wrong departure time for his flight, telling him the plane left at 8:15 inches the morning when it actually departed at 7:45. These two things together, the hangover-induced slowness and the incorrect departure time, meant that Seth MacFarlane arrived at the airport approximately 10 to 15 minutes after the gates had closed for flight 11. The plane had pushed back from the gate at 7:46 that morning, essentially on schedule. MacFarlane was standing in the terminal, unable to board. He rebooked on a later flight, found a spot in the airport lounge, and fell asleep. He woke up roughly 40 minutes later to commotion. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Everyone aboard 92 passengers and crew was dead. MacFarlane recalled the experience in various interviews over the years, with a kind of deliberate calm that he seemed to have cultivated around a story that could easily have become defining in a way he did not want it to be. He told Howard Stern that the experience was rattling for the first few weeks, obviously. He was candid about the fact that it did not lead him to any particular sense of fate or cosmic significance. He said, "My answer to all that is, it's such a dull, boring answer because I'm so of the mindset that, coincidences happen. I'm not much of a fate person," he also noted, with the kind of self-aware humor that is most genuine when it is slightly uncomfortable. that he is late for things all the time, and that this had simply been a case where his ordinary tendency to be late had intersected with one of the most catastrophic days in American history. What makes the story worth exploring in the context of Family Guy is not the near-death experience itself, though that is obviously remarkable, but rather what happened to the show in the wake of it. Family Guy had already incorporated references to Osama bin Laden before the attacks. The deleted scene from Death Has a Shadow is the most obvious example. After September 11, the show navigated the same territory that every American entertainment program had to navigate: how to exist in a world that had just experienced something that made comedy feel impossible, and then, gradually, how to slowly begin making comedy again without seeming callous. The show referenced September 11 inches various ways over its subsequent seasons. In the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode of the show, a genuinely clever piece of meta-storytelling. While there, Stewie tells Brian that they could prevent September 11 if they wanted to. Brian is initially drawn to the idea, but the episode then explores what that would mean: the chain of consequences, the way history would ripple outward from that single change, and ultimately concludes that the attempt to prevent the attacks causes far greater damage in its own way. The episode ends with Stewie and Brian making the decision to go back and allow the attacks to happen, which is a genuinely dark conclusion for an animated comedy to arrive at. The episode treats the subject with more seriousness than many people expected from Family Guy, and it is one of the more thoughtful engagements with 9/11 that the show produced. But the broader question that MacFarlane's story raises is a philosophical one that the show occasionally circled without fully landing on. What does it mean to make comedy about terrible things when you have a direct personal connection to one of the most terrible things that happened in recent memory? MacFarlane seems to have answered this question for himself by simply continuing to make comedy, by not treating his near miss on Flight 11 as a defining origin story, and by making the creative space around Family Guy as expansive as possible, including the space to make jokes about events that other people might have thought should be off limits. There were people who found this approach offensive. There were people who felt that MacFarlane's proximity to the attacks gave him a special understanding that other comedians lacked, and that he was using that understanding responsibly. There were people who felt that no amount of proximity made certain jokes acceptable. All of those positions existed simultaneously in the audience's response to the show's post-9/11 episodes. What is clear is that MacFarlane never treated his near miss on Flight 11 as a reason to become more cautious with Family Guy's comedy. If anything, the experience seems to have reinforced his view that the universe is random, that coincidences happen, that there is no particular cosmic significance to survival, and that making comedy is a legitimate and valuable response to a world that contains both extraordinary suffering and extraordinary absurdity. The fact that Family Guy exists at all is partly the result of a hangover and a travel agent's error. The fact that it continued to exist and to make the kind of comedy it made provocative, uncomfortable, occasionally brilliant, occasionally awful is partly the result of MacFarlane's specific personality and his specific way of understanding what comedy is for. The near miss on Flight 11 is part of that story. It is not the whole story, and MacFarlane himself seems to prefer that it not be treated as the whole story. But it is there, in the background of everything that came after, as one of those remarkable coincidences that shape a life without announcing themselves as significant. Section 7. The Quagmire's Dad episode. What was intended and what actually landed. Among all of the Family Guy episodes that generated controversy after they aired, as opposed to the ones that were banned before they could, the 8th season episode Quagmire's Dad occupies a particular place. It is controversial not because it was banned, not because of timing, not because of a lawsuit or a conspiracy theory. It is controversial because of what it tried to do, and the gap between that intention and what it actually accomplished. And because that gap opened up over a subject transgender identity and representation that carries enormous weight for real people. The episode aired on the 9th of May, 2010. The premise is straightforward. Glenn Quagmire's father, Dan, a retired Navy lieutenant commander, returns to town and reveals that he is a transgender woman who intends to undergo gender-affirming surgery. Dan becomes Ida, and while this is happening, Brian Griffin meets Ida in a hotel bar, does not know who she is, has sex with her, and discovers afterward that he has slept with Quagmire's newly transitioned parent. Quagmire then beats Brian severely for this. The episode ends with some degree of reconciliation between Quagmire and Ida. Seth MacFarlane was not shy about defending the episode before it aired. In an interview roughly 2 months before the episode was broadcast, he told LGBT media outlet After Elton that the episode would be a sympathetic portrayal of a transsexual character and expressed genuine enthusiasm for what the show was attempting. He also voiced Ida himself, which is a detail worth noting, since MacFarlane voices several of the show's most significant characters, and his choice to voice this one suggested a personal investment in how the character came across. The episode generated pushback from multiple directions almost immediately after it aired. GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, criticized the episode for its handling of transgender identity, citing several specific moments as harmful to transgender people. The Parents Television Council, which has always positioned itself on the opposite end of the cultural spectrum from GLAAD and usually objects to Family Guy for completely different reasons, also named the episode its Worst TV Show of the Week, though their specific objections were about the explicit sexual content and the violence rather than about the transgender representation. The specific moment that drew the most sustained criticism and that remains the most discussed scene in the episode is the one where Brian discovers that Ida is transgender. He vomits for 30 uninterrupted seconds. The scene is extended, sustained, and detailed in its disgust. Brian then compares Ida to a sex offender in a separate line, saying that he thought people like that were supposed to notify the neighborhood when they moved in, and then he retreats to a bathroom to continue processing his horror at what he has learned. MacFarlane defended this scene in a later interview by arguing that Brian is a heterosexual character, and that a heterosexual man discovering he had slept with a transgender woman might plausibly react with disgust. He compared it to how a gay man might react to an unexpected sexual encounter with a woman. The comparison did not land well with the critics who had objected to the scene, partly because the scene was not presented as a reflection of Brian's specific psychology, but as a comedic spectacle, an extended gross-out gag of the sort Family Guy had been using for years, now deployed in response to the revelation that someone is transgender. The distinction between those two things matters enormously. Brian vomiting because of who he slept with, presented as a character moment about his specific reaction, is one thing. Brian vomiting for 30 seconds as a comedy bit in a way that frames a transgender woman's existence as the source of his nausea is another. The episode seemed to want both simultaneously to have the scene be emotionally honest about a character's reaction while also being funny. And the 30-second duration, which is not a character beat but a comedy gag extended past any naturalistic justification, is what tips the balance. A character can have an uncomfortable reaction. A 30-second vomit routine is a spectacle of disgust presented for laughs. What makes the episode genuinely complicated rather than simply bad is that there are real moments of generosity toward Ida within it. Quagmire's eventual acceptance of his parent is handled with some care. The episode does not present Ida as a predator or a fraud. She is shown as a person who has simply chosen to live as who she is, and the episode's resolution acknowledges that Quagmire needs to find a way to accept this even if he is struggling. Ida's dinner with the Griffin family, despite the food being thrown away by Lois in a moment of casual cruelty, has genuine warmth in a few of its exchanges. The character of Ida, in the scenes where she is simply being herself rather than being a vehicle for someone else's reaction, is treated with more dignity than many critics gave the episode credit for. But the episode's accumulation of problematic moments, the vomiting, the sex offender comparison, "is that a Toblerone or a joke?" directed at Meg asking Ida if she had surgery, the way multiple characters' transphobia is presented without pushback from the narrative creates something that functions, whatever its intentions were, as a showcase of negative stereotypes about transgender people dressed up in the costume of satirical intent. The satire, if it was there, was not strong enough to contain the harm of the images. MacFarlane expressed surprise at the depth of the negative reaction. In a September 2010 interview in Details magazine, he said, "I don't meet a lot of stupid homosexuals," which was his somewhat convoluted way of suggesting that the people criticizing the episode were misreading its intent. The response from critics and advocates was that intent and impact are not the same thing, and that an episode which functions as a 30-second-long vomit response to a transgender woman's existence has a real-world impact on how transgender people are perceived, regardless of what the writer wanted it to accomplish. The show later revisited the character of Ida Davis in subsequent seasons, mostly in smaller contexts, and handled her with varying degrees of success. A season 17 episode called Trans Fat took another swing at transgender themes with considerably more care and a clearer acknowledgement of how the previous treatment had fallen short. But Quagmire's Dad remains in the archive, with its extended vomit scene, its sex offender comparison, and the particular gap between what Seth MacFarlane said he wanted to do and what the episode actually did. Caitlin Olsen voiced Brenda in Screams of Silence with real commitment. MacFarlane voiced Ida in Quagmire's Dad with real commitment. The commitment of the performances does not resolve the questions raised by the writing. Both episodes are in the catalog. Both remain available to watch, and the conversations they generated have not ended. Section 8. Was Meg always supposed to be the punching bag? The mystery of the show's most mistreated character. There is a version of this story that is simple. The writers of Family Guy decided early in the show's history that Meg Griffin would be the character whose suffering was played for laughs, and they followed that decision to its logical conclusion for about a decade before reconsidering. That version is probably partially true. But it leaves out something important, the evidence, scattered across interviews and DVD commentaries and the show's own internal logic, that Meg's treatment was not entirely planned, that it grew into something darker than anyone had intended, fed by audience reaction and the writer's increasing willingness to use her as a shorthand for a specific kind of comedy that requires a designated target. Mila Kunis began voicing Meg in the show's second season. Lacey Chabert voiced her in the first season before departing for reasons connected to the show's uncertain early status. Kunis has spoken in interviews about the strangeness of being associated with a character who is primarily defined by her suffering and about the real-world bleed of that association. People would come up to Mila Kunis and use the show's catchphrase dismissal directed at Meg. A dismissive line that becomes so associated with a character's rejection that it follows the actress who gives that character her voice into real-world interactions. The fictional cruelty had a real-world address. In the earliest seasons, Meg was simply the least interesting member of an extremely interesting family. This was intentional, and it had a specific comedic logic. When you have a baby who secretly wants to kill his mother, a talking dog who drinks martinis, a father who approaches every situation with the reasoning capacity of a golden retriever, and a mother who holds the household together through sheer determination, the comedic contrast of having one completely normal teenage girl in that environment is real and workable. Meg's ordinariness was the joke, not Meg herself. Her unpopularity at school, her desperation to be noticed, her inability to connect with the cool kids. These were recognizable teenage experiences, rendered slightly more comedic by the extraordinary context surrounding them. The shift happened gradually, and it happened in two phases. The first phase began around the fourth season, when the jokes about Meg stopped being about her being ordinary and boring and started being about her being physically unattractive. This is a meaningful change. The joke about someone being boring is a joke about their personality, which is theoretically something they could address. The joke about someone being ugly is a joke about their body, which they cannot address, and which carries a particular cruelty because it removes even the fictional possibility of the character improving their situation. Once the show committed to the position that Meg was fundamentally, irreparably unattractive and that this was inherently funny, it had made a choice about what kind of humor this was, and it was not a generous kind. The second phase was worse. By the time you reach seasons 8 through 14, the jokes about Meg had escalated from general mockery to something that looked more like a sustained project of degradation. Peter's behavior toward his own daughter moved from being inattentive and occasionally insensitive to being actively abusive physically, verbally, and in the sense of consistently treating her as if she did not deserve basic human dignity. The show revealed in a flashback that Peter and Lois had tried to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was a baby, presenting this as a punchline. Peter would, in various episodes, fart in Meg's face, shove her, refer to her with language that reduced her to an object of disgust, and openly express relief when she was not present. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party addressed this directly and became one of the most discussed episodes in this entire story. Trapped in the house during a hurricane, Meg finally confronts her family. She tells them exactly how they have treated her and what that treatment has done to her. She calls out Peter for being a terrible father, Lois for being a bad mother, Brian for his casual cruelty. The speech is raw and specific and right. It says true things about characters' behavior in a way that the show rarely allowed. Fans who had been watching Meg be mistreated for seasons felt, watching this scene, like the show was finally acknowledging what it had done and giving its most abused character her moment. And then the episode takes the turn that made critics furious. After Meg's outburst, the family begins to fall apart without her as their shared target. They turn on each other. The house becomes chaotic. And the episode concludes with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily taking back everything she said. She accepts that her role in the family is to absorb the abuse, because without her absorbing it, the family cannot function. She agrees to go back to being the punching bag. The messaging is genuinely troubling when you look at it directly. The episode is saying, without irony, that victims of sustained abuse should accept their victimhood because their acceptance is what keeps the people around them stable. It is saying that standing up for yourself is selfish because it disrupts the people who are hurting you. It frames Meg's capitulation as a kind of sacrifice, as if absorbing years of her family's cruelty is a gift she gives them. Whether the writers intended this reading or not, it is what the episode communicates, and the fan response was not kind. What makes this mysterious, and the word mysterious is the right one here, is that the show had also demonstrated, in scattered episodes across the same seasons, that it knew how to write Meg as a full character. The crossover episode where Meg meets Lisa Simpson gives her genuine warmth and discovers a talent in her. The episode Peter's Sister in season 14 gives the family's mistreatment of Meg a psychological explanation rooted in Peter's own childhood experience of abuse. Both of these episodes treat Meg as a person rather than a device. Both suggest that the writers, at their best and when they chose to be, understood who Meg was and could write her with real humanity. Why, then, did those episodes not stick? Why did the show keep resetting to the cruelty rather than building on the moments of genuine character development? The most honest answer is probably the simplest one, because the cruelty was easy and the audience had been trained to expect it. The Meg abuse jokes had become such a defining feature of the show's identity in those middle seasons that any episode that tried to treat her differently felt like an exception rather than a direction. And exceptions in a show that had committed to a particular version of a character tend not to last. The mystery of Meg Griffin is ultimately the mystery of what Family Guy was willing to be at its worst when it discovered that an audience would laugh at a specific kind of suffering. The show had always tested boundaries. It had always pushed past comfortable limits, but most of its transgressive comedy was built on a kind of mutual absurdity. Everyone was a target, everything was equally ridiculous, and the show's nihilism was at least consistent in its application. The Meg storyline departed from that consistency. It became something more targeted and more sustained, aimed at a single character, week after week, in ways that the comedy did not fully justify. And the fact that the show eventually pulled back, that by the later seasons the extreme abuse had largely stopped, suggests that someone in the decision chain recognized that something had gone wrong. It just took a very long time for them to act on that recognition. Section 9. Brian Griffin's death. The stunt that broke the internet. There have been many surprising things that happened over the course of Family Guy's 2-0+ year run. Characters have changed dramatically. Storylines have been controversial. Episodes have been banned and pulled and criticized from every angle. But no single story development in the show's history generated quite the same volume of immediate, sustained, passionate reaction as what happened in the 12th season, in an episode called Life of Brian. The episode aired on the 24th of November, 2013. In it, Brian Griffin, the family's talking dog, one of the show's original four main characters, the character that Seth MacFarlane himself had spoken of with evident affection in many interviews over the years, was struck by a car and killed. The Griffin family mourned him. Stewie, whose relationship with Brian had been one of the show's most consistent emotional through lines, was devastated in a way that felt genuinely affecting. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, was introduced as a replacement. The internet did not take this quietly. Social media, and this was 2013, when social media reactions were still a relatively new phenomenon in their current form, erupted with grief, fury, and disbelief. A petition to bring Brian back gathered tens of thousands of signatures within days. News organizations covered the story as if reporting on a real death. The mourning was not entirely performative. People had been watching Brian Griffin for 14 years. They had grown up with him, in a sense. The emotional investment was real. Then, 2 episodes later, on the 15th of December, 2013, 3 weeks after Brian had been killed, an episode called Christmas Guy aired. In it, Stewie uses a stolen time travel device to go back in time and save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back to life. Everything was undone. Vinny disappeared. The status quo was restored as if the death had never happened. The reaction to the reversal was, if anything, angrier than the reaction to the death itself. Because while the death had been shocking and upsetting, it had at least been something a genuine story development, a willingness to change the show's landscape in a permanent way. The reversal transformed the death into something else entirely, a ratings manipulation, a trick, a way of generating buzz and viewership for a few weeks before hitting reset and going back to the comfortable version of the show. MacFarlane confirmed, in a 2014 interview with USA Today, that Brian's death had never been intended to be permanent. He said the whole exercise was designed to surprise people and to demonstrate that the show was not afraid to shake things up. He described the team's primary goal as generating buzz, which they had certainly accomplished. But the admission that the death was always temporary transformed it retroactively. Every person who had mourned Brian, every person who had signed the petition, every person who had argued passionately in comment sections about what the show meant and what it had lost, all of that emotional investment had been in a fake death, designed to make them feel exactly that investment. This is where the story gets philosophically interesting in a way that goes beyond any single creative decision. The Life of Brian and Christmas Guy pairing represents a particular kind of manipulation that became more common in television during this era. The willingness to deliver genuine emotional impact in order to use that impact as a marketing tool, with the full understanding that the impact would be reversed once it had served its purpose. It is not quite the same as a character arc. It is not quite the same as a cliffhanger. It is a story development designed to be emotionally true in the moment and commercially exploitable in the weeks between the death and the resurrection. For long-term Family Guy fans, the Brian death and resurrection crystallized something that had been building for several seasons. The feeling that the show had become more interested in getting a reaction than in earning one. The earlier seasons had generated plenty of reactions, shock, laughter, occasional discomfort, but those reactions were byproducts of the comedy and storytelling rather than the stated goal. By season 12, the death of Brian was executed with what felt like a primary calculation of audience response, rather than story logic. What will make people feel the most? What will make the most noise? And when the noise had served its purpose, what is the quickest way to undo it? Brian returned from the dead and, as discussed in many analyses of the show's character development, proceeded in subsequent seasons to become in many ways a worse version of himself than he had been before he died. The pattern of selfishness, hypocrisy, and casual cruelty that critics had been documenting in the character for seasons continued, and in some ways intensified. The emotional depth of the farewell of Stewie's grief, of the family's mourning, was used up and discarded when the character came back. The grief had been purchased at the cost of future credibility. When you have already killed and resurrected a character as a rating stunt, the emotional stakes of everything that character does afterward are permanently diminished. One of the more telling details about this whole story is the speed of it. 3 weeks. The death aired on November 24th. The resurrection aired on December 15th. The network moved quickly enough that the petition to bring Brian back had barely had time to gather signatures before the restoration was already in post-production. This was not a death that was reconsidered in response to fan outcry. This was a death that was always going to be temporary, executed on a specific schedule, timed to maximize the emotional amplitude of a Christmas episode. The grief was engineered. The petition was, in that context, part of the plan rather than a departure from it. What the whole episode, in the broader sense of the word, revealed about Family Guy in its 12th season is something the show's critics had been arguing for years. That the show had become more comfortable with spectacle than with story. more interested in reaction than in the work that earns a reaction. Brian's death was the most dramatic expression of that comfort. It was also, for many long-term viewers, the moment they stopped expecting the show to try to be good in the way it had been good at the beginning and started simply watching to see what it would do next. Section 10. The Stewie sexuality question. A mystery the show has never fully answered. Of all the ongoing mysteries in Family Guy's universe, and there are many, more than the show has ever fully accounted for the one that has generated the most consistent fan discussion, the most interviews, and the most deliberate ambiguity from the people who make the show, is the question of Stewie Griffin's sexuality. This seems, on the surface, like a question with an obvious answer. Stewie has, across many seasons of the show, displayed behavior that codes as stereotypically feminine, expressed attraction to male characters, worn women's clothing on multiple occasions, and been written with a consistent set of interests and personality traits that the show has repeatedly used as the basis for jokes about his potential homosexuality. By the later seasons, these references are so frequent that they constitute a dominant aspect of his characterization. To many viewers, particularly those who came to the show in its middle or later seasons, Stewie's sexuality seems like settled territory. Everyone knows he is gay. The show has been making jokes about it for years. It is just not technically confirmed. But the question of whether the show has actually confirmed Stewie's sexuality is more complicated than that framing suggests. And the answer is genuinely interesting as a window into how the show has always thought about its characters and what it is willing to commit to. The earliest version of Stewie Griffin, the version from the first 3 seasons, the evil genius baby who built weapons and plotted to kill his mother, was not written with explicit sexuality at all. He was written as a villain, a character whose menace came from the contrast between his infant body and his sophisticated, murderous intellect. His references to things that might read as feminine, a concern about the appearance of his diaper, a fondness for certain kinds of entertainment were present in small doses as additional layers of absurdity rather than as statements about his orientation. The character's primary identity was as a tiny homicidal genius. Everything else was texture. Starting around the 4th season, as the evil genius concept was being deliberately phased out in favor of the softer, more emotionally expressive Stewie, the character's expressed interests and behaviors shifted noticeably. He began cross-dressing with more regularity. His language became more explicitly suggestive about attraction to male characters. Episodes began building plots around his interest in a male character who did not reciprocate. The jokes became more sustained and more central to how Stewie was written. The most authoritative answer the show has ever given came from Seth MacFarlane in a Playboy interview, where he said that Stewie would ultimately be either gay or a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. This is simultaneously a confirmation that the show considers Stewie's orientation to be non-heterosexual and a refusal to commit to any specific version of what that means. MacFarlane also said, in other contexts, that it was better to keep it vague, a phrase that captures the show's fundamental approach to the Stewie sexuality question. The vagueness is not accidental. It is a deliberate creative decision. The decision to keep it vague has practical roots. An episode in the show's middle seasons was apparently at some point planned in which Stewie would formally come out as gay. The episode was developed to some degree before being abandoned. MacFarlane has described the decision to scrap the planned coming out episode as being based on his feeling that the vagueness served the character better, that once Stewie's sexuality is explicitly confirmed, a certain kind of comedy becomes unavailable to the show. The jokes that depend on ambiguity, on suggestion, on the audience reading between lines, those jokes disappear the moment the show commits to a definitive answer. There is an argument that this reasoning is generous to the show's intent and less generous to the gay characters and viewers who might have benefited from seeing Stewie explicitly acknowledged as gay and treated with full dignity in that identity. The counter-argument, which MacFarlane has made in various forms, is that an ambiguous Stewie is a more interesting and more universal character than a confirmed gay Stewie would be. That the mystery serves the comedy better than any resolution would. Season 16 introduced another piece of the puzzle. An episode revealed that Stewie's British accent is artificial, that it is, in his words, a coat of armor he uses to feel special, and that his natural speech patterns are American. This revelation reframed years of the show's history in an interesting way. If the accent is performed, if the sophisticated British villain persona is a construction Stewie has built around himself, then everything about early Stewie becomes slightly more ambiguous. The world domination plots, the elaborate weaponry, the menacing rhetoric, all of it filtered through a baby who is performing a version of himself that he has decided to adopt because it makes him feel powerful and significant. If that is true of the accent, the question arises: how much of what we understand about Stewie is genuinely who he is versus who he has decided to be? And if the sexuality jokes are part of a larger performance, a character who is constantly aware of and commenting on his own constructed identity, then the refusal to confirm or deny becomes not just a comedy decision but a thematic one. Stewie is a show about performance. The vagueness about his sexuality is one more element of that performance, held deliberately open so that the audience can never quite settle on a fixed version of who he really is. Whether that reading is generous or simply convenient is a question the show has never had to answer, because it has never committed to one. The mystery of Stewie's sexuality is, in a sense, the mystery of Stewie himself, a character who began as something extremely specific and was gradually transformed into something much more open-ended, and who now exists in a state of permanent ambiguity that the show uses as both a creative resource and a way of avoiding the harder work of definitively saying what kind of person this baby is. The audience has largely made up its own mind. The internet's answer to the question, "Is Stewie gay?" is fairly close to unanimous. The show's answer remains, officially, a question. Section 11. When the show's jokes came true, the real-world fallout. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from watching a cartoon joke and then watching the real world catch up to it. It does not mean the joke caused the real thing. It does not mean the writers predicted anything in any meaningful sense. But the coincidence has a weight to it that is hard to dismiss, and Family Guy has accumulated more of these coincidences than most animated comedies, in part because it has been on the air for so long, and in part because it has always been willing to make jokes about specific things that could plausibly happen. The Boston Marathon coincidence has already been discussed in detail. The Turban Cowboy situation was a case where the conspiracy theory was false, but the coincidence was real. An episode airing with a gag about mass deaths at the Boston Marathon approximately a month before mass deaths at the Boston Marathon. The timeline, the proximity, and the specific location all created a coincidence dramatic enough that a conspiracy theory built around it could gain traction for at least a few hours before being debunked. But there are others. The show made jokes about certain specific things about famous people, about political developments, about cultural moments that later happened in real life. Some of these are trivial, some are not. All of them contribute to the strange mythology that has grown up around Family Guy as a show that occasionally, accidentally, appears to know things before they happen. The show's relationship with real-world tragedy is something Seth MacFarlane has addressed directly in various contexts. His position has consistently been that the show is not predicting anything, that it is making jokes about the kinds of things that happen in the world, and that a show that makes thousands of such jokes over 2 decades will occasionally overlap with real events. This is almost certainly correct. The probability math is not complicated. A show that runs for 25 seasons and produces jokes about every conceivable type of incident will, if any of those incidents actually occur, appear to have predicted something. What is more interesting than any individual coincidence is the pattern of how the show has been perceived in relation to real events. The Turban Cowboy situation is the clearest example. The conspiracy theory that attached itself to the episode was not primarily about the episode. It was about a cultural anxiety about whether the entertainment we consume shapes the events that happen to us, about whether jokes about violence normalize or even inspire violence. These are legitimate questions. They are not answered by pointing to a Family Guy episode and claiming it inspired a bombing. But the fact that the claim could spread as quickly as it did in 2013 reveals something about the moment and about how some people understand the relationship between media and reality. The Venezuelan government's reaction to the Season 7 episode 420, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional Rhode Island town where the Griffins live, was another kind of real-world fallout. Venezuela's justice minister at the time took formal objection to the episode, arguing that it represented American cultural influence promoting drug use, and cable stations in Venezuela were warned they could be fined for continuing to air Family Guy. This was a real diplomatic and regulatory response to a cartoon episode about a dog's politics. There were also real-world reactions that came from the communities depicted or referenced in episodes. Religious organizations lodged formal complaints about episodes involving Jesus, God, the Pope, and various denominations. Ethnic and national communities objected to specific caricatures. Political figures occasionally responded to their portrayals in the show, some with humor, some with hostility. The show generated a level of real-world engagement from institutions and communities that most animated comedies never reach, which is a testament to its cultural reach and also to the specific way it chose to use that reach. The more thoughtful question that all of this raises is about the relationship between satire and reality over time. The early seasons of Family Guy operated in a satirical register that felt relatively clear. The jokes were pointed at specific targets, the intent was recognizable, and the absurdity of the show's universe created enough distance from reality that the commentary was experienced as commentary rather than as documentation. As the show continued, the relationship between its universe and the real world became murkier. The jokes became bigger and more extreme. The real world, in various ways, became bigger and more extreme too. And the distance that had made the early satire feel safe and funny began to close. When a comedy about a fictional American family making jokes about terrorism, political corruption, and social dysfunction exists in a world where those same things are happening in increasingly dramatic ways. When the joke and the reality start to feel like they are occupying the same register, the comedy itself changes. This is not something anyone planned. It is just what happens to satire that runs long enough. The world catches up to the jokes, and sometimes the jokes catch up to the world. And neither of those coincidences means anything except that we have been living in a particular kind of time, and the show has been running long enough to collect the coincidences. Section 12. The biggest mysteries the show has never answered. Family Guy is a show built on a specific paradox. It creates characters and a world with enormous internal detail and consistency, and then it treats that detail and consistency as irrelevant whenever it is inconvenient. The Griffin family lives in a fully realized fictional town with recurring characters, ongoing storylines, and relationships that span decades of the show's history. And yet the show has always maintained the right to contradict itself, to reset its characters, and to introduce or abandon plot elements without explanation. This paradox has produced, over 2, 5+ seasons, a remarkable number of genuinely unanswered questions. Mysteries that the show has either never addressed inconsistently, or addressed and then immediately contradicted. Start with the most fundamental one. Can the adults in the show hear Stewie? This question has never been given a stable answer. In the earliest seasons, there were clear indications that most adults could not understand Stewie. His elaborate speeches about world domination would be received by the adults around him as baby babbling. This was the source of a specific kind of comedy, the dramatic irony of an audience knowing something the characters did not. Brian was established as one of the few characters who could actually hear and understand Stewie, which is part of what made their friendship feel special. But over the course of the show's run, this rule has been violated constantly and inconsistently. There are episodes where adults clearly understand Stewie and respond to what he says. There are other episodes in the same season where the same characters treat him as if he is just making baby sounds. The show has never committed to a definitive answer about who can hear Stewie and under what circumstances. Fans have proposed various theories that it depends on who the writers needed to hear him for a given episode's plot, or that there is some in-universe explanation involving perception or magical realism, but the show itself has never engaged with the question in a sustained way. Then there is the matter of the show's own continuity and what it calls its permanent changes. Over the course of its run, Family Guy has introduced developments that seemed like they would permanently alter the show's universe, only to have those developments quietly disappear without explanation. Cleveland left the show to star in his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons. When The Cleveland Show ended, Cleveland returned to Family Guy without the transition being treated as a major story event. Meg's position in the family, the level of abuse she received, and the nature of her relationships with her parents and siblings shifted dramatically between seasons and often within seasons, in ways that the show never fully accounted for. Brian's death and resurrection represents the show's most dramatic example of a permanent change being reversed, but it is not the only one. The show has also killed other characters, Adam West's fictional version of himself, various recurring characters, and handled those deaths with varying degrees of consistency in the episodes that followed. Some deaths stuck, some were treated as permanent and then quietly forgotten. The show's universe operates on its own internal rules about what is reversible and what is not, and those rules have never been clearly articulated. The question of how old the characters are and why they never age is another ongoing mystery that the show has occasionally acknowledged but never resolved. Stewie has been 1 year old for over 2 decades of broadcast time. Chris and Meg have been teenagers throughout the show's run. The show has made jokes about its own refusal to age its characters, which is the simplest and most honest acknowledgement of a reality that every long-running animated sitcom faces. The format depends on keeping characters in roughly the same life stage indefinitely, because the comedy is built on those specific dynamics. But Family Guy has occasionally engaged with the passage of time in ways that are difficult to reconcile with the no-aging rule. Characters have made references to events that establish specific years. The show has incorporated real-world events that are dated. Certain storylines have implied significant time passing, and yet Meg is still in high school, Stewie is still in his playpen, and Peter still has the same bar friends he has always had. The show's relationship with time is selective in a way that creates mysteries it was never intended to address. The mystery of Stewie's real accent, addressed in the season 16 reveal, opened more questions than it answered. If the British accent is a construction, if it is a coat of armor that Stewie adopted for personal reasons, then what is the underlying story? When did he decide to do this? How old was he when he chose to be the evil British baby rather than whatever he would have been otherwise? The reveal reframes his entire history without providing the context that would make that reframing meaningful. Then there is the question of the show's own self-awareness. Family Guy has always played with fourth wall breaks, with characters acknowledging they are in a television show, with references to the show's own production history, cancellations, and controversies. This meta-awareness has been one of the show's signature moves since the beginning, but it creates a specific kind of mystery. How much of what happens in the show's universe is real, and how much is a performance for an audience that the characters know is watching? The question cannot be fully answered because the show uses both registers simultaneously. Sometimes the characters exist in a fully realized world where their choices have real consequences, and sometimes they step outside that world to make a joke about being in a television show. Both are valid modes for the show to operate in, but they are not reconcilable with each other, and the show has never tried to reconcile them. What might be the show's most genuinely unanswered question is also its simplest. What is the show actually about? In the first 3 seasons, the answer was clear. It was about a dysfunctional but loving family in a small American city, seen through the specific lens of a comedy that was willing to go places other shows would not. The characters had defined roles, and the show had a clear identity. As the years passed and the characters changed, and the show's priorities shifted, that original clarity became harder to find. The show in its 20s is not quite the same show as the one that started in 1999, but it has also never articulated what it became instead. This is ultimately the biggest mystery in Family Guy's long history. Not a plot point, not a character detail, not a banned episode. The mystery is what the show has been trying to do for the last 15 years, and whether it has any idea, the answers the show has given through the quality of individual episodes, through the choices made about characters, through the willingness or unwillingness to engage meaningfully with the subjects it raises, are inconsistent. Sometimes brilliant, more often mediocre, occasionally actively harmful, but always, beneath all of it, connected to something that was genuinely great in those first 3 seasons. Something that the show has been chasing, or perhaps unconsciously running from ever since. The mystery of Family Guy is the mystery of what happens when you create something special and then have to keep making it after the specialness has found its natural conclusion. The show that exists today carries the fingerprints of everything. It has been the banned episodes, the pulled scenes, the character transformations, the real-world controversies, The near-deaths and the actual deaths and the resurrections. All of that history is in there somewhere, in the background of every episode, shaping the show's identity whether the current writers are thinking about it or not. And somewhere in that history, in the specific weight of partial terms of endearment, sitting on a shelf, in the 30 seconds of Brian vomiting, in Meg taking back everything she said about her family, in the hangover that kept Seth MacFarlane off a plane, in the first 3 seasons of a show that was trying very hard to be something true, is a version of Family Guy that understood exactly what it was and what it was for. The show that followed it has been searching for that understanding ever since. And the search has been, in its own strange and sometimes painful way, as interesting as anything the original show produced. If you made it all the way here, thank you for spending this time with me. This was a long journey through some genuinely strange, genuinely interesting corners of one of television's most complicated stories. If you found this relaxing or informative or just a good thing to have on while you drift off, please leave a like and subscribe. It makes a real difference. Drop a comment if you are still awake, and let me know what you thought, what I missed, or what you would want to hear about next. Sleep well, and until next time, take care of yourself. Script for Uncle Guy Lore-style ASMR content approximately 32,000 words. Section 3, Turban Cowboy, the Boston Marathon, and the Speed of Conspiracy. There are 2 kinds of episodes that get pulled from the air. The first kind gets pulled because of what is inside it, because someone looked at the content and decided the subject was too dangerous, too sensitive, or too politically volatile to allow on a network broadcast. The second kind gets pulled because of something that happened outside the episode entirely, something in the real world that makes the fictional content suddenly feel impossible to watch. The content might be fine on its own terms. It might have been fine the week it aired, but the world shifted, and now the episode exists inside a new context, and that new context makes it unbearable to leave on the air. Turban Cowboy is unmistakably the second kind. It aired on Fox on the 17th of March 2013, during the show's 11th season, and by every conventional measure of success, it was a perfectly ordinary episode. Nearly 5 million people watched it. It was the highest-rated program on Fox's Sunday animation lineup that night. The critics were not kind. One reviewer at the AV Club gave it a D and described it as feeling like an episode written in 2002 that had been left on a shelf and forgotten, but critical displeasure had never been a reliable indicator of whether a Family Guy episode would generate lasting controversy. Bad reviews came and went. The show kept going. What stopped Turban Cowboy was not a bad review. It was the Boston Marathon bombing on the 15th of April 2013. To understand how the episode ended up in the center of one of the strangest media controversies of that year, you need to know what was in it. The plot follows Peter Griffin as he takes up skydiving with his friends. An accident during one of his jumps lands him in a hospital bed next to a Muslim man named Mahmoud. The two become friends. Peter brings Mahmoud into his social circle, and Joe and Quagmire become suspicious of the newcomer, suspicious in ways the episode frames, at least for its first 2/3, as Islamophobic prejudice that the audience is meant to recognize as misguided. Brian explicitly calls both of them out for their assumptions. The argument the episode is making, or appears to be making, is that judging a person based on their religion is wrong, and that real friendship transcends cultural difference. Then, the episode's final act reveals that Mahmoud is a terrorist. He was planning to bomb a bridge. His friendship with Peter was partly genuine, but also served as cover. Joe and Quagmire, who had been framed as the episode's wrong-headed prejudice, turn out to have been correct. The implicit argument that the episode appeared to be building about not judging Muslims as terrorists is structurally undermined by revealing the Muslim character to actually be a terrorist. This is a real problem with the episode as a piece of storytelling, and critics had already noted it, but this was not what made the episode famous. What made the episode famous were 2 specific scenes that had no narrative connection to each other. The first was a cutaway gag, the kind of brief, disconnected visual joke the show had been deploying since its first episode, in which Peter is shown winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the race, mowing down other runners as he goes. This was the kind of gag Family Guy produced constantly. Sudden, excessive, cartoon violence played as a quick visual punchline. Disposable. Forgotten almost before the next scene began. The second was a plot beat in the episode's climax. Peter, having been caught up in Mahmoud's terrorist plans, accidentally triggers explosives using a cell phone. These two scenes existed in completely separate parts of the episode. Minutes of other content separated them. No viewer watching the episode as broadcast would have experienced them as connected to each other in any way. They shared a general territory violence, Boston, a phone being used in relation to an explosion, but they were not the same scene, not the same sequence, not part of the same narrative thread. On the 15th of April 2013, someone took those two scenes, cut them together, and uploaded the edited version to YouTube. The clip presented them as a single continuous sequence, creating the impression that the episode had depicted Peter winning the Boston Marathon by running down runners with a car and then detonating a bomb. This edited clip was then amplified by Alex Jones on his InfoWars platform and on Twitter, where Jones and his followers distributed it with the claim that Family Guy had predicted or possibly inspired the real bombing. Seth MacFarlane responded within hours. He posted on Twitter, "The edited Family Guy clip currently circulating is abhorrent. The event was a crime and a tragedy, and my thoughts are with the victims." Fox moved simultaneously. The network pulled the episode from Fox.com and from Hulu the same day. They issued a statement confirming the removal and noting that they had no immediate plans to rebroadcast the episode. The conspiracy theory was debunked quickly. The editing was obvious to anyone who looked at it carefully. The two scenes were plainly from different parts of the episode, with different settings and different contexts. Alex Jones's claim that the show had somehow predicted or staged the bombing was not taken seriously by any reputable news organization. Within a few days, the fabricated clip had been largely removed from major platforms, and the conspiracy narrative had been relegated to the fringes where it had originated. But the episode stayed off American platforms for 9 years. It returned to Hulu in September of 2022, receiving minimal attention, the controversy long since receded. By then, it was a mediocre episode from a decade earlier that most current viewers had never thought about. What is worth sitting with in the Turban Cowboy story is not the conspiracy theory, which was obviously false from the beginning and collapsed quickly. What is worth sitting with is the speed. Within hours of the Boston Marathon bombing, before the perpetrators had been identified, before the investigation had produced any conclusions about what had happened or why, a conspiracy narrative connecting a cartoon episode to a terrorist attack had spread far enough that the show's creator needed to publicly denounce it. That speed, the velocity at which a false and harmful narrative can move through a connected audience, is remarkable. And it reveals something about the relationship between Family Guy's audience and the show itself, about the sense among some viewers that the show existed in a charged relationship with reality, that its jokes and cutaways were connected to the real world in ways that went beyond entertainment. The episode's underlying problems, the Islamophobia baked into its twist, the failure of the anti-prejudice message it had appeared to be building, were real and legitimate topics for criticism. The criticism of those problems, the discussion of what the episode got wrong about depicting Muslim characters, would have been worthwhile and appropriate. Instead, the episode was consumed by a false narrative that had nothing to do with those real problems. And the false narrative was eventually debunked, while the real problems went largely unaddressed, because the sensational conspiracy crowded out the more useful conversation. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the way Family Guy's controversies have played out. The real issues, the representation problems, the harmful messaging, the ethical questions about what comedy is allowed to do often get buried under more dramatic but less substantive conversations. The Turban Cowboy situation is a clear example. The thing that became the story was a lie, while the things that were actually worth discussing were left behind. Section 4. The luckiest hangover in history. Seth MacFarlane and American Airlines Flight 11. The story of Seth MacFarlane's near miss on the 11th of September 2001 is one of the most remarkable biographical footnotes in the history of American television. It is documented, confirmed, and verifiably true. MacFarlane has told it in multiple interviews over many years, including a detailed account on The Howard Stern Show in 2009 that brought the story to its widest audience. And it sits at the intersection of so many things: personal history, professional history, the relationship between Family Guy and September 11, the strange way that randomness shapes the course of individual lives, that it deserves sustained attention. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11, the early morning transcontinental flight from Boston Logan International Airport to Los Angeles International Airport. He had been in Rhode Island the night before, giving a lecture at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he had studied animation and developed the concepts that became Family Guy. After the lecture, as young creative people do after events like that, he went out with friends. He stayed out later than he should have. He had more to drink than was strictly advisable given that he had an early flight the next morning. And when his alarm went off the following day, he was carrying the particular combination of headache and reluctance that a late night and too many drinks produces. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. The flight, MacFarlane was told, left at 8:15 the morning. The actual departure was scheduled for 7:45. These two things together, the slower morning produced by the previous night and the incorrect time that meant he was aiming for a plane that had already left, meant that Seth MacFarlane arrived at Boston Logan approximately 10 to 15 minutes after the gates had closed for Flight 11. The plane had pushed back from the gate at 7:46, 1 minute behind schedule. The gate was closed. He could not board. He rebooked on a later flight. He found the airport lounge, chose a seat, and fell asleep. About 40 minutes later, he woke to a commotion he could not immediately interpret. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked and deliberately crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Everyone aboard, 92 people, including passengers and crew, was dead. The flight was the first of 4 that morning. The day that began with a hungover animator missing his plane by 15 minutes became one of the defining catastrophes of the 21st century. MacFarlane's assistant, who had taken a message that MacFarlane had rebooked onto a different flight, had not yet received or processed that message when news of the attack broke. For approximately 20 minutes, people who knew his travel plans believed he might have been on the plane. The relief when he made contact and confirmed he was alive was the relief that comes from a very close call that has been, by the smallest possible margin, avoided. In the Howard Stern interview and in other conversations over the years, MacFarlane has been consistently deliberate about how he describes the experience. He does not dramatize it. He does not speak of it as a transforming event that gave his life new meaning or new direction. He said the experience was rattling for the first few weeks, obviously. He acknowledged the strangeness of having been 15 minutes from a different outcome. But he pushed back explicitly against any framing that made the near miss feel destined or significant in a cosmic sense. He told Stern that he was not much of a fate person, that coincidences happen, that he had missed other flights for similar reasons, that this one had consequences that other missed flights did not, but that this was a matter of coincidence rather than purpose. He also noted, with the self-aware humor that is most real when it is slightly uncomfortable, that he has always been late for things, that missing a plane because he was moving slowly in the morning was not, for him, an unusual experience. The September 11 morning was unusual only in the consequence of that lateness. The connection between MacFarlane's personal proximity to September 11 and Family Guy's creative history with September 11 is something that has been discussed over the years without ever being fully resolved. The show had already, before the attacks, produced material that would become newly significant in their aftermath. The airport scene from the pilot episode in which Stewie distracts security while weapons pass through undetected, and a parallel scene shows Osama bin Laden attempting the same maneuver had been made in 1999, when bin Laden was a known threat operating at a level of abstraction that American popular culture could still treat as material for comedy. After September 11, the scene was removed from rerun schedules and early DVD releases. It became one of the show's ghost scenes present in some versions, absent in others, available to anyone who looked for it but officially treated as no longer part of the show's normal presentation. The decade following the attacks produced various Family Guy episodes that engaged with September 11, terrorism, and the world that had been created by those events. The Season 10 episode, Back to the Pilot, is the show's most direct and sustained engagement with the topic. In it, Brian and Stewie's time travel brings them back to the world of the show's first episode, where they confront the possibility of preventing the September 11 attacks before they occur. The episode takes the thought experiment seriously. Brian is drawn to the idea of preventing something so catastrophic, But the episode follows the chain of consequences that any time travel narrative requires, tracing what a different September 11 would mean for the subsequent history of the country and the world, and ultimately concluding that preventing the attacks would create problems at least as serious as those the attacks themselves caused. Stewie and Brian decide to allow the attacks to happen. This is a genuinely dark conclusion for an animated comedy. The episode earns it by doing the work, by engaging with the complexity of the counterfactual, rather than treating the thought experiment as a simple wish fulfillment. MacFarlane never spoke publicly about his personal proximity to September 11 as a factor in how the show engaged with the topic. His consistent public position was that the near miss was a remarkable coincidence, and that he preferred not to attach excessive meaning to it. This seems genuine. The same person who said, "I'm not much of a fate person," in one interview said in another that his experience of being at the airport when the attacks happened had been rattling for the first few weeks, but that he had moved through it and moved on. He is not someone who appears to have built his identity around what he almost experienced on that morning. And yet the show's engagement with September 11, with terrorism, with American foreign policy and military action, and the specific anxieties of the post-2001 world. All of this exists in a context that includes the knowledge that the show's creator was 15 minutes from being on one of those planes. It does not determine the meaning of any individual episode. It does not make any particular joke more or less appropriate. But it is part of the context, and context matters when you are trying to understand why a show makes the specific choices it makes. The luckiest hangover in television history, 15 minutes, a travel agent's error, a later morning than planned. And the result is that Family Guy continued, that Seth MacFarlane continued, that the next 20-plus years of episodes were made and broadcast and discussed and argued about. This is not a cosmic statement. It is a fact about how randomly the world assigns its outcomes. And it is part of the story of everything that came after, whether or not that story requires it to be. Section 5. Quagmire's Dad. The gap between intention and communication. In the spring of 2010, Seth MacFarlane told a LGBT media outlet that an upcoming Family Guy episode would be a sympathetic portrayal of a transsexual character. He said this approximately 2 months before the episode aired. He was not being evasive or managing expectations. He believed what he was saying. He had personal investment in the episode. He was voicing the trans character himself, in addition to his usual roles. He thought the show had produced something that the LGBT community would recognize as an honest attempt at representation. The episode aired on the 9th of May 2010. It was called Quagmire's Dad. And the distance between what MacFarlane said he intended and what the episode actually communicated to its audience is one of the most instructive gaps in the show's entire history. The premise is built around the discovery that Glenn Quagmire's father, Dan, a retired Navy veteran and the person Quagmire has always most admired, is a transgender woman who has decided to have gender-affirming surgery and live as Ida. This revelation upends Quagmire's sense of identity and his relationship with the person he thought he knew. The episode's stated goal is to follow Quagmire through his resistance and eventual acceptance of his parents' transition, with the emotional arc landing on a reconciliation that the show presents as genuinely moving. There is real material in this premise. The specific experience of discovering that someone you have idealized your entire life is a different person than you believed. The disorientation, the grief, the difficulty of integrating a new reality with an established relationship, these are things that actually happen to people and deserve serious treatment. Quagmire's confusion and initial rejection of Ida are written as human responses to a shocking discovery, not as malicious bigotry, and the episode's resolution takes him from resistance to genuine acceptance in a way that feels emotionally true in its final moments. But the episode does not only tell Quagmire's story, it also tells Brian's. And the way the show chose to tell Brian's part of the story is where the episode's problems become severe and lasting. Brian is away at a seminar during Ida's surgery and recovery. He stops at a hotel bar on his way home, meets Ida, they connect, and they sleep together. Brian does not know that Ida is Quagmire's parent. He does not know that Ida is transgender. He experiences what he experiences as a connection with an attractive woman who interests him. The next morning, when Stewie shows Brian a photo of Ida on his phone and confirms that he has slept with Quagmire's transitioned parent, Brian's reaction is the scene that the episode is now primarily remembered for. He vomits continuously. For 30 uninterrupted seconds, the camera holds on him. The sound design commits to every aspect of it. Stewie watches in confusion, then alarm. The 30 seconds pass. Brian then retreats to a bathroom to continue the process of washing himself, clearly in a state of profound horror at what he has learned. MacFarlane's defense of this scene has been consistent. Brian is a heterosexual character, and a heterosexual man discovering he had unknowingly slept with a transgender woman might plausibly react with intense physical discomfort. He compared this to the reaction a gay man might have to an unexpected sexual encounter with a woman. The argument is that sexual orientation is real, that finding yourself outside your orientation's expectations unexpectedly is genuinely disorienting, and that Brian's reaction reflects something real about the experience of that disorientation. The problem is that this defense describes a character moment. The scene is not a character moment. It is a comedy gag built on extended disgust, executed with the same structural logic as every other Family Guy gross-out scene. The joke is the duration, the escalation, the commitment to the bit. The comedy depends on the audience sharing, or at least recognizing, the disgust being expressed. What produces the disgust in the character and, by the structure of the joke, in the audience that is meant to find it funny is the revelation that the person Brian slept with is transgender. The trans woman's identity is the source of the comedy. 30 seconds of vomiting is the measurement of how disgusting her existence is. Brian also, in a separate moment, compares Ida to a sex offender by saying he thought people like her were supposed to notify the neighborhood when they moved somewhere new. This line is not the product of a character wrestling with complex feelings. It is a joke. The punchline is the comparison between a transgender woman and a sex offender. The joke works to the extent that it works by treating trans identity as something in the same category as criminal behavior that requires community warning. The line lands in a world that was already, in 2010, producing real violence against transgender people, partly on the basis of exactly this kind of dehumanizing comparison. GLAAD responded quickly and critically. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation named the episode as one of the most harmful depictions of a transgender person on American television in 2010. The Parents Television Council, which comes from an entirely different political direction than GLAAD and usually criticizes Family Guy for completely different reasons, also named it the worst show of the week. Though the PTC's objections were centered on the sexual content and violence rather than the trans representation, both organizations, from opposite ends of the cultural spectrum, found something worth condemning in the episode. MacFarlane expressed genuine surprise at the depth of the negative reaction. He seemed to have believed his own characterization of the episode as sympathetic. This surprise is itself revealing. It suggests a specific kind of gap between a creator's understanding of their own intentions and their understanding of how the work they produce actually functions as communication. A writer who understands why a 30-second vomiting gag triggered by trans identity communicates hostility toward trans people, regardless of the writer's personal feelings, is a writer who would not have written the scene that way. The fact that MacFarlane was surprised by the criticism suggests that he had not understood how the scene worked, not as a statement of his personal views, but as a piece of comedy built on a specific structure that communicated a specific thing. The distinction between intention and communication is not a subtle one in most cases. Comedy communicates through its structure, through what it treats as the punchline, through what it treats as the source of the humor, through what it presents as the obvious or natural reaction to a given situation. A scene in which a character vomits for 30 seconds in response to learning someone is transgender communicates, through its structure, that trans identity is something that produces that response. The communication happens regardless of what the writer intended to say about trans people. The structure of the joke is the message. There are real virtues in Quagmire's dad. Quagmire's eventual acceptance of Ida is handled with genuine care. The performance MacFarlane gives to Ida in her calmer moments treats her as a person rather than a punchline. The episode's resolution is emotionally earned. These things exist alongside the vomiting scene and the sex offender comparison, not separate from them, and this combination is what makes the episode complicated rather than simply bad. But complicated is not the same as successful. The episode tried to do two incompatible things simultaneously to make Ida sympathetic and to make the revelation of her identity a source of extended physical comedy, and the incompatibility produced an episode that could claim good intentions while delivering harmful content. The gap between what MacFarlane said he intended and what the episode communicated is the gap between a creator's private understanding of their work and the work's actual public existence as a piece of media that functions independently of those private understandings. Section 6. The Screams of Silence. Problem seriousness the show hadn't earned. Not every Family Guy controversy is about something the show got away with. Some of the most important moments in the show's history are about something it tried to do and failed to do badly enough that the failure itself became the story. Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q is not a banned episode. It is not an episode that was pulled from broadcast after the fact. It is an episode that aired, was judged immediately and harshly by critics and advocates, and has remained in the archive ever since as a permanent record of what happens when a show attempts to engage seriously with a subject it is not equipped to treat seriously. The episode aired on the 30th of October 2011, in Family Guy's 10th season. It was written by Alex Sulkin, a long-serving executive producer, and directed by Dominic Bianchi. Its premise involves Quagmire's sister Brenda and her abusive boyfriend Jeff. The abuse depicted in the episode is explicit and unambiguous. Jeff hits Brenda, demeans her, and threatens her throughout the episode in ways the show does not soften or undercut with comedy. This is unusual for Family Guy. The show had always had dark humor, but the darkness had generally been filtered through the show's comedic register. Things were exaggerated, absurdized, distanced through the specific kind of cartoon logic the show deployed. Screams of Silence took a genuine social problem and attempted to engage with it as genuine drama rather than as comedy material. In principle, this is admirable. In execution, it failed in ways that the show's subsequent reputation has never allowed anyone to forget. The fundamental problem is character. The episode asks the audience to be emotionally moved by Glenn Quagmire's efforts to protect his sister from an abuser. This requires Quagmire to function as a sympathetic moral agent, as a person whose concern for Brenda feels genuine and whose outrage at Jeff's behavior feels like outrage the audience should share. The trouble is that Quagmire's history in the show makes this impossible. This is a character whose relationship with women has been built across a decade of the show on a foundation of predatory behavior, sexual coercion, and what the show has always treated as harmless comedy. The show had normalized treating women as objects for Quagmire's gratification since his earliest appearances. And now the show was asking him to be the hero of a story about the importance of treating women with dignity. The episode cannot square this circle. Every line Quagmire delivers about respecting women, about Brenda's worth and her right to safety, and her deserving better than what Jeff gives her, lands in the shadow of everything the audience knows about how Quagmire has treated women throughout the show's run. The words are right. The character saying them makes the words wrong. The episode wants the audience to feel something real about Quagmire's protective love for his sister, without being able to address the fact that the protective love exists alongside a history of behavior that makes him one of the least appropriate possible characters to deliver a message about respecting women. Quagmire's speech to Brenda, in which he tells her she does not deserve to be called a woman for staying with an abuser, is the episode's most criticized moment, and rightfully so. The intention, presumably, is to express the extremity of Quagmire's frustration with Brenda's denial and his desperation to make her understand the danger she is in. What the line communicates is something different and genuinely harmful. That people who remain in abusive relationships have forfeited something, that the failure to leave is a reflection of inadequacy. This is victim blaming stated directly, with no apparent awareness that it is victim blaming, from a character who is supposed to be the episode's moral center. The resolution compounds the problem. Quagmire, Peter, and Joe kill Jeff. They lure him on a hunting trip and run him over with a car. They then present Brenda with a forged note from Jeff saying he has decided to leave her. They do not tell her he is dead. They remove her abuser by murdering him, conceal the murder from her, and hand her a lie that they have decided is better for her than the truth. The episode presents this as a satisfying conclusion. Brenda is freed. The men handled it. The woman was protected through the men's management of her situation and her information. The episode received negative reviews across the board from critics who covered it. Kevin McFarland at the AV Club wrote that it crippled the show's strengths by trying to be serious inside a format built on irreverence and failing at both simultaneously. Advocates for domestic violence awareness wrote about the episode's misrepresentation of why people stay in abusive relationships, its victim-blaming messaging, and the specific harm of presenting the murder of an abuser as a clean solution to the complex psychological aftermath of sustained abuse. Brenda is pregnant during the episode. The question of what happens to her child raised by a woman who has been through sustained psychological and physical abuse, who has been lied to about the circumstances of her freedom, who has not received any of the support or therapy that survivors of abuse need is never addressed. The episode ends with the men satisfied with their solution and Brenda in grief over what she thinks is abandonment. The story the episode is actually telling, about the aftermath of abuse and the complex work of recovery, has not begun. It has ended without having started. What Screams of Silence reveals about Family Guy in its 10th season is something the show had been approaching in various ways for years. The fundamental mismatch between the characters the show had created and the stories those characters could credibly tell. The show had made Peter Griffin a genuinely abusive father and husband in its middle seasons, played for laughs. It had made Quagmire a predator played for laughs. It had made Joe a police officer who had allowed serious harm to happen without intervention, played for laughs. And then it asked these three men to be the heroes of a story about domestic violence, and it expected the audience to take that story seriously. The audience did not take it seriously because the show had not done the work that would allow that seriousness. The building of characters who have earned moral authority through consistent behavior, the slow development of relationships that feel genuinely at stake, cannot be done in a single episode when the previous decade of episodes has been building something entirely different. The episode aired, critics panned it, advocates condemned it, and the show moved on to the next episode, taking nothing from the failure, returning immediately to its usual mode. The same pattern that characterized so much of Family Guy's middle seasons. A moment of attempted seriousness, a failure to achieve it, and then the reset button, as if nothing had happened. Section 7. The invisible archive cuts, censored scenes, and deleted history. Not every controversy in Family Guy's long history arrived packaged as a complete episode that was either banned or pulled. Many of the most revealing moments in the show's engagement with its own limits happened at a more granular level, at the level of individual scenes, specific cutaway gags, single lines of dialogue that were removed between the production draft and the final broadcast, or that appeared once and then disappeared from reruns and streaming versions. The history of what has been cut from Family Guy over its entire run is extensive enough to constitute its own archive. And that archive, when you look at it carefully, tells a story about the ongoing negotiation between the show and the various authorities networks, streaming platforms, corporate owners, cultural contexts that have always had some say in what it was allowed to be. The most historically significant category of cuts is the post-September 11 removals. The airport gag from the first episode, the Osama bin Laden scene that predated the attacks by 2 years, has already been discussed in detail. But it was not the only thing that changed in the show's presentation of itself after September 11. Various other scenes and references across the early episodes were reviewed in the aftermath of the attacks, and some were modified or removed in response to the changed context. The show existed in a pre-September 11 cultural atmosphere when those early episodes were made, and that atmosphere was gone. Some of what had been produced in it was no longer appropriate to continue circulating without alteration. The process of these changes is itself instructive. When scenes or lines are removed from episodes that originally aired with those scenes or lines present, what remains is a gap, a slightly different version of the episode that differs from what people originally saw without explicitly announcing that it differs. The viewer who watched a specific episode in original broadcast and then watches it again 20 years later on a streaming platform may or may not notice that something has changed. If they notice, they may not know what was there before. The invisible edits accumulate across years and versions and platforms, creating a show that exists in multiple forms simultaneously. The Family Guy censorship documentation maintained by dedicated fans tracks these changes with remarkable precision. The differences between the Fox broadcast version of an episode, the Adult Swim version, the TBS version, the DVD version, the Hulu version, and the Disney Plus version of the same episode are sometimes trivial. A beeped word here, a shortened scene there, and sometimes more significant. Scenes that were standard in one release have been trimmed or removed in another. Lines that appeared in original broadcast have been altered in reruns. Visual gags that passed the original broadcast standards review were adjusted when the episode moved to a different platform with different standards. The Disney acquisition of Fox in 2019 created a new layer of complexity. When Disney became Family Guy's corporate parent, the show's long history of jokes about Disney properties required new consideration. The show had made Disney jokes since its earliest seasons, parodies of specific films, references to specific characters, jokes about the company itself that ranged from affectionate to critical. After the acquisition, some of this material was in a newly ambiguous position. Jokes about a company made by people who now worked for that company, distributed on platforms that company controlled, alongside content that company had created. The specific adjustments made in response to this situation have been tracked by fans and occasionally discussed in media coverage of the transition. Partial Terms of Endearment remains the most dramatic example of platform absence. The episode is not on Hulu. It is not on Disney+. It was not on the streaming platforms that carried Family Guy before either of those services existed. Its absence is total and consistent, and has been maintained across every change in the show's distribution landscape. This is the most significant piece of the invisible archive, not a scene that was cut, not a line that was altered, but an entire episode that has been systematically excluded from every American distribution channel for more than 15 years. There are also the storylines that never made it past the development stage. The episode addressing Quagmire's history with women in the context of the Me Too movement is the most publicly discussed of these, a story confirmed to have been in development that never reached production for reasons that were never officially stated. The decision not to make this episode is in some ways more revealing than most of the decisions that were made. It suggests an awareness, somewhere in the show's decision-making hierarchy, that certain subjects directly connected to the show's own, most problematic content, could not be engaged with honestly without exposing things about the show itself that nobody wanted exposed. A show that spent years making jokes about Quagmire's behavior toward women, jokes that functioned as normalization and as comedy, that never once required the character to face meaningful consequences for that behavior. That show was not positioned to make an honest Me Too episode about that same character. The honest version of the episode would have required acknowledging that the comedy had been part of the problem. The dishonest version would have been worse than making no episode at all. The decision not to make either, and not to explain why, is the show choosing silence over confrontation. It is the invisible archive at its most revealing, the loudest absence. These absences and edits and removals are part of what Family Guy is. The show that exists on streaming platforms today is not identical to the show that originally aired across its decades of broadcast. The accumulated changes, the removed scenes, the altered lines, the absent episodes, the development room decisions that never became production, are as much a part of the show's history as the episodes that did make it to air. They tell a story about where the limits were, who enforced them, and what the show was and was not willing to do when those limits were challenged. Section 8. Was Meg's suffering always the plan? The question of whether Meg Griffin's treatment was always planned, whether someone sat down at the beginning of the show's run and decided that this character would be the designated recipient of abuse for years, is one of the most genuinely uncertain questions in Family Guy's history. The answer, based on everything available in interviews, commentaries, and the show's own internal evidence, is probably that the answer is no. The sustained abuse was not planned, but it was permitted, and the failure to stop it before it went as far as it did reflects something important about how the people making the show understood what they were doing and who they were doing it to. In the first 3 seasons, Meg was the show's straight man. She was the ordinary teenager in an extraordinary family. Her ordinariness was the comedic contrast that made the rest of the family's extraordinary qualities more visible. She was unpopular at school and slightly boring at home, but her family did not despise her. Peter's occasional insensitivity toward her was the kind of thing that Peter was insensitive about with everyone, not specifically targeted, not sustained, not cruel in the way it would later become. The family's indifference to Meg was the joke, not Meg herself. The shift happened gradually, beginning around the 4th season, and had multiple causes. The most fundamental was the show's discovery that making Meg the subject of family contempt rather than just family indifference got a specific and reliable kind of response from the audience. There is a particular flavor of dark comedy that involves designating a character as someone that everyone around them openly disdains. And when that character is already positioned as the least interesting member of the family, the escalation from indifference to contempt can feel almost natural, like following a logic that was already present in the original setup. Each incremental step seemed connected to the previous one. Each escalation felt like a continuation of something rather than a departure. And by the time the escalation had reached a place that was genuinely troubling, the show had built enough momentum around the pattern that stopping or reversing it would have required a deliberate decision that nobody seemed willing to make. By the middle seasons, roughly seasons 8 through 14, what had begun as the joke about the ordinary teenager had become something quite different. Peter's behavior toward Meg had moved from inattentiveness to active cruelty. The flashback revealing that Peter and Lois had tried to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was a baby, played as a quick comedy beat, is probably the clearest single marker of how far the show had traveled from its original design. In the original version of the family, the version from season 1 where Peter was a lovable idiot who meant well and sometimes forgot things that flashback would have been impossible, that Peter would not have done that. That Peter was not capable of that specific kind of careless cruelty toward his own daughter. The Peter who would do that was a different character from the one the show had started with. And the Meg who was the target of that behavior was a different character too, not the ordinary teenager whose ordinariness was a contrast, but a character defined almost entirely by her victimhood, whose existence had been reduced to the jokes made at her expense. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since the second season, has spoken with remarkable candor in various interviews about what the role meant and how it felt to be associated with a character defined by suffering. She described being approached in public by people who used the show's dismissive phrase directed at Meg as a form of communication with her. The fictional family's rejection of the fictional daughter mapped onto interactions between a real person and a real actress. The performance of the character had created enough cultural resonance that the character's abuse followed its performer into the real world. Kunis also discussed, in some of these interviews, her own relationship to the material. The question of how you engage with voicing a character whose primary narrative function is to be mistreated, and how you sustain that engagement across years of recording sessions. Her answer, to the extent she provided one, was that she found ways to connect with what was human in Meg regardless of what the story was doing to her in any given episode. The humanity was always there, even when the writing was not engaging with it. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the show's own clearest engagement with the question of what it had done to Meg. The Hurricane episode, which traps the Griffin family together, provides the structure for Meg's confrontation with her family, a confrontation that is written with real specificity and real accuracy. Everything Meg says in her speech is true. The show knows it is true. The episode feels, watching it, like the show is acknowledging its own history and preparing to do something about it. And then the episode ends with Meg taking it all back, voluntarily returning to the punching bag role because, as the episode tells us, the family's stability depends on having a designated recipient of their frustrations. The message this sends is troubling in a specific way, that victims of sustained abuse should accept their role because their acceptance is what maintains the system around them. That standing up for yourself is selfish. That the correct response to years of mistreatment is to quietly resume being mistreated so that no one else has to deal with the consequences of stopping. Whether the writers intended this message is almost beside the point. This is what the episode communicates. And it communicates it in the context of a character who has been the show's designated target for abuse for multiple seasons, which makes the message not just philosophically troubling, but personally applicable in the worst possible way. The show eventually began to pull back on the extreme Meg abuse, and by the later seasons the pattern had largely moderated. This is worth acknowledging without overstating the moderation was real. The later seasons do treat Meg with more consistency and more dignity, and the worst of the abuse stopped. But the decade-long record remained, and the show never fully accounted for it. There was no episode that addressed the full scope of what the pattern had been and what it had said. There were individual episodes that treated Meg better. And then the show continued. The mystery of Meg Griffin is ultimately the mystery of what happens when a comedic device becomes a character, and then the people using the device forget that the character is in there. The irony is that Meg, if you strip away the abuse and the contempt and the comedic dismissal, is probably the most sympathetic figure in the Griffin family. She wants to be loved. She wants to be seen. She wants her parents to be proud of her and her peers to include her and the world to acknowledge that she matters. These are the most basic human desires. They are the desires that make the most natural connection between a fictional character and a real audience. And the show, for a very long time, used those desires as the material for a joke that required the audience to find her wanting them funny. Section 9. Brian's Death, the Stunt, and Its Consequences. Among all the story developments in Family Guy's history, Brian Griffin's death in the 12th season stands alone as the clearest example of the show, using its own emotional capital as a promotional resource. It is not the most controversial story development in the show's history. It is the one that most completely reveals the calculation that had come to drive the show's creative decisions, the willingness to spend accumulated audience investment in exchange for short-term attention. Brian died on the 24th of November, 2013, struck by a car while playing in the street outside the Griffin house. The episode titled Life of Brian gave the death real weight. The family's grief was written with genuine feeling. Stewie's response to losing his closest friend was particular and specific and emotionally true in a way that the show's later seasons had made feel rare. A new dog named Vinny was introduced, voiced by Tony Sirico, and the episode devoted real time to the family beginning to adjust to Brian's absence and to Vinny's presence. The grief was not cheap. The episode was trying to do something genuine. The internet's response was extraordinary. Social media erupted. News organizations covered the death as a significant cultural event. A petition demanding Brian's return gathered tens of thousands of signatures within days. The grief was real. 14 years of watching a character accumulates real attachment, and the people who had watched Brian since 1999 had invested something genuine in who he was. The emotional stakes of his death felt earned by that investment, even to viewers who had been critical of how Brian had been written in the show's middle and later seasons. Brian Griffin was resurrected on the 15th of December 2013 in an episode called Christmas Guy. Stewie used a time travel device to go back and prevent Brian from being struck by the car. Brian came back to life. The new dog Vinny was erased from the timeline. The status quo was restored as if nothing had happened. The resurrection was met with anger that in some ways exceeded the grief that had greeted the death. Because the death, for all its emotional impact, had been at least serious, at least a genuine story development, at least a willingness to change the show's landscape in a way that felt irreversible. The resurrection transformed it retroactively into something else, a marketing exercise. 3 weeks of emotional response, harvested deliberately, then discarded once the ratings cycle it had generated had served its purpose. MacFarlane confirmed this in a subsequent interview. The death had never been intended to be permanent. The goal was to generate buzz, to surprise people, to demonstrate that the show was not afraid to take risks. All of those goals had been accomplished. Brian was always coming back. The timeline of events, death, November 24, resurrection, December 15, 3 weeks exactly reflects the production schedule of a seasonal ratings play rather than an organic story development. The confirmation that the death was always temporary changes what the petition meant. Tens of thousands of people signed a petition demanding the return of a character whose death had already been planned as a temporary event. The petition was not a fan response to something real that had happened. It was a fan response to a simulation of something happening, staged specifically to produce that response. The grief was genuine. The thing the grief was responding to was not. What Brian's death and resurrection did to the show's credibility as a storytelling project is something the show has never fully recovered from. The emotional stakes of everything that happens in Family Guy after December 2013 are permanently diminished by the knowledge that the show is willing to do this to manufacture what looks like permanent change, exploit the emotional response, and then reverse it cleanly. If Brian can die and come back in 3 weeks, then nothing in Family Guy's universe carries real weight. Every apparently permanent development exists under the shadow of the resurrection, reminding the audience that the show can undo anything whenever it becomes convenient. Brian continued in subsequent seasons in versions of himself that many observers found even more problematic than the pre-death Brian had been. The emotional capital of his farewell, the grief that had been spent on him, the weight his character had been given in the death episode was used up in the resurrection and did not restore. What came back was a Brian whose behavior continued in the patterns that critics had been documenting for years. The selfishness continued. The hypocrisy continued. The gap between who Brian claimed to be and who he actually was continued. The death had not changed him. The grief had not regenerated him. He came back the same and stayed the same, and the audience that had mourned him was left with a version of the character that the mourning had not improved. Section 10. The Stewie question: gay, straight, or something the show will never fully commit to. The mystery of Stewie Griffin's sexuality is the mystery that the show has most deliberately cultivated and most consistently refused to resolve. It is the open question that the people making the show have protected most carefully, for the longest time, on grounds that have been explained in various ways at various points, without ever fully satisfying either the people asking the question or the people who want the question left open. Start with what is visible and undeniable. For well over a decade of the show's run, Stewie has been written with a consistent set of behaviors, interests, expressed attractions, and personality characteristics that invoke, with great specificity, stereotypes associated with gay male identity. He cross-dresses. He expresses attraction to male characters. He uses language coded as effeminate in the specific way the show codes effeminacy. He has had storylines built around his interest in specific male characters. The show has mined this territory for comedy so consistently and for so long that the suggestion that Stewie might be straight requires more evidence than the suggestion that he might be gay. But the show has never confirmed it. MacFarlane, in his most direct statement on the subject, a Playboy interview that is widely cited on this topic, said that Stewie would ultimately be gay or a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. This statement simultaneously acknowledges that the show considers Stewie to be somewhere on the non-heterosexual spectrum and declines to be more specific about where. In other interviews, MacFarlane has said it is better to keep it vague, that ambiguity serves the character better than confirmation would. A planned coming-out episode was developed at some point and then abandoned on these grounds. The defense of the vagueness is that ambiguity allows a kind of comedy that confirmation forecloses. Once Stewie is explicitly confirmed as gay, certain jokes that depend on the audience reading between the lines are no longer available. The show loses flexibility. The character becomes more specific in ways that limit what can be done with him. This is a real creative argument. It is not wrong on its own terms. Ambiguity is a resource in storytelling, and using it deliberately is a valid creative choice. But the criticism of the vagueness is equally valid. The pattern of behavior the show uses to construct Stewie's apparent homosexuality relies heavily on stereotypes on coded effeminacy, on specific mannerisms and interests that have historically been used to mark gay characters in media without confirming their identity. This pattern allows the show to make gay jokes without acknowledging that it is making gay jokes, to include gay content without accepting responsibility for how that content represents gay people. The vagueness protects the show's ability to keep making these jokes indefinitely, as long as it never has to commit to the character actually being gay and treating that identity with the full humanity it deserves. The season 16 revelation about Stewie's British accent added a new dimension to all of this without resolving anything. The episode Send in Stewie, please establish that the British accent is artificial, a persona Stewie adopted to feel special, to mark himself as distinct from the world around him. He describes it as a coat of armor. His natural speech patterns are American. This revelation reframes Stewie's entire characterization retroactively. The British villain persona, the theatrical menace, the sophisticated language and elaborate schemes, all of it has been a performance, not an expression of who he naturally is. If the British persona is a performance, the question naturally arises, what else is performance? The evil genius was, apparently, performed. The world domination plotting was part of the persona. Is the current softer, more emotionally open Stewie also a performance? Or is this the version underneath the performances, the real Stewie that was always there, waiting for the coat of armor to come off? And where does Stewie's sexuality fit into this structure of performances and authentic selves? The show does not answer these questions. It provides the revelation about the accent and then continues, with Stewie as he has been, in the direction the character has been developing. The revelation is offered as a real piece of information about the character and then not followed through to any of its logical implications. This is characteristic of how Family Guy handles its own mysteries, providing pieces of information that feel significant without the sustained engagement that would make them actually meaningful. What the Stewie mystery ultimately reveals is something about the show's relationship with commitment. Family Guy has always been a show that prefers the option to any particular choice. Keeping Stewie's sexuality ambiguous preserves options. Confirming it would close them off. The show values the availability of the comedy over the honesty that confirmation would require. And this preference for availability over honesty is, in various forms, the preference that characterizes most of the show's significant decisions. The preference to have things available as raw material rather than committing to them as actual content. The audience has made up its own mind on the subject. The internet's consensus is that Stewie is gay, has always been gay, and that the show's refusal to confirm it is a choice that serves the show's interests rather than the characters. This consensus is probably correct. The show knows it is probably correct. And the show has decided, after considering the question for more than 20 years, that it prefers the mystery. Section 11. When comedy touched reality, the show's real-world fallout. Over more than 25 years of production, Family Guy has collided with the real world in ways that ranged from uncomfortable coincidence to actual policy responses from governments to real-world impacts on real people. Some of these collisions were predictable. The show always aimed at targets that were likely to hit back. Others were the product of pure timing, the show's content becoming newly resonant in contexts its creators had not anticipated. Taken together, these collisions tell a story about what it means to make comedy about the world inside the world over a long enough period of time. The most dramatic individual collision is the Turban Cowboy and Boston Marathon situation, already covered in detail. But there were others. The Venezuelan government's response to the Season 7 episode 420, in which Brian campaigns to legalize marijuana in the fictional town, is one of the stranger entries in this category. Venezuela's justice minister at the time took formal regulatory action in response to the episode's apparent promotion of drug use, warning cable stations in the country that they could be fined for continuing to air Family Guy. This was a sovereign government's official response to a cartoon episode about a talking dog's politics. The response was widely covered as a curiosity but was real in its regulatory implications for broadcasters in Venezuela. There were also more diffuse real-world impacts, the ways in which the show's treatment of specific communities and subjects contributed to or reflected broader cultural conversations. The Quagmire's Dad episode aired in the same year that transgender representation in American media was beginning a period of more careful and nuanced treatment. The episode, as discussed, was behind that curve in ways that felt anachronistic even at the time. The gap between how trans people were beginning to be represented elsewhere in the culture and how Family Guy chose to represent them in this episode was visible in 2010 and has only become more visible since. The Screams of Silence episode had real-world impact in the domestic violence advocacy community, where the episode was used in a kind of perverse but instructive way as an example of how not to portray abuse in media. Organizations working on domestic violence education pointed to specific elements of the episode as examples of victim blaming, misrepresentation, and the romanticization of vigilante solutions to abuse. The episode became, for some advocates, a useful text precisely because of how comprehensively it failed a collection of the most common and damaging misconceptions about domestic violence, assembled in one place. The real-world impact of the Meg abuse storyline specifically, the bleed of the fictional abuse into real-world interactions involving Mila Kunis, represents a different category of fallout. It is not the show's content affecting audiences in aggregate, but the show's choices following its performer into her individual real-world experience. When people use a fictional character's abuse catchphrase as a way of interacting with the actress who voices that character, the fiction and the reality have merged in a way that the show's creators probably did not intend and probably did not fully consider. The fictional abuse found a real-world address. The joke reached beyond the screen. Family Guy was also responsible for a lawsuit, the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein copyright case, that produced a significant ruling on the scope of parody as a fair use defense. The ruling in favor of the show's use of "when you wish upon a star" has been cited in subsequent legal discussions about the boundaries of parody in copyright law. A Fox animated comedy generated a piece of legal history that has had implications for how fair use doctrine applies to musical parody. This is probably not what anyone involved in making the episode had in mind. These collisions between the show and the real world, some dramatic, some tragic, some legal, some personal, are part of what Family Guy is and what it has done over its long run. The show has always existed in the real world rather than separate from it, always aimed at things that were real and affected by them in return. The collisions were not accidents, not entirely. A show that pushes into every corner of culture, that targets every sensitive subject, that refuses to declare any territory off limits, is going to generate collisions. The collisions are the price of the ambition. Whether the price was worth it is a question that depends on what you think the ambition achieved, and that is a question that every person who has watched Family Guy has to answer for themselves. Section 12. The biggest unsolved mysteries of the Family Guy universe. After 25 years and more than 400 episodes, Family Guy has accumulated a remarkable number of questions it has raised without answering questions about its characters, its world, its internal logic, and its own identity as a creative project. Some of these are genuinely mysterious. Some are simply the product of a show that has been on long enough to generate contradictions. All of them are part of what the show has become over time. The most fundamental ongoing mystery is the question of Stewie's comprehensibility to the adult characters around him. In the early seasons, the show operated on the premise that most adults heard Stewie as baby sounds rather than as the elaborate speeches the audience received. Brian was the primary exception, which gave their friendship a special quality. He could hear Stewie when nobody else could. This was the source of specific comedy that depended on the gap between what Stewie was saying and what the adults understood him to be saying. But this rule has been violated so many times, so inconsistently, across so many seasons, that it is functionally meaningless as a description of how the show's universe works. Adults hear Stewie when the story needs them to hear him. They do not hear him when the story needs them not to. The rule exists as a convenience that the show invokes when useful and ignores when inconvenient. It is one of the most vivid examples of Family Guy's preference for flexibility over consistency. The question of the characters' ages and their relationship with time is another mystery the show acknowledges without resolving. Stewie has been 1 year old for the show's entire run. Meg has been in high school since 1999. The show incorporates real-world events and technologies as they occur in the actual world. Characters use smartphones, reference current events, inhabit a present that matches the year the episode was produced, but the characters themselves do not age in response to the passage of all that time. The show has made jokes about this. Characters have referenced the impossibility of their own temporal situation. But the acknowledgement has never led to any change in how the show handles the question. The continuity between Family Guy and its spin-off The Cleveland Show represents a separate, ongoing mystery. Cleveland Brown was a founding member of Peter's friend group. He left the show and spent 4 seasons in his own spin-off, with a different family in a different state. He returned to Family Guy after The Cleveland Show ended, and the show continued as if the transition required minimal acknowledgement. The relationships Cleveland formed in his spin-off, the experiences he had, the version of his life that played out over 4 seasons of separate television, all of this exists in an ambiguous relationship with the Family Guy universe that the show has never clarified. The question of what any of the show's story developments actually mean, whether any change is permanent, whether growth ever sticks, whether the emotional stakes of any given episode carry forward into the episodes that follow, is the deepest version of all these mysteries combined. The show has demonstrated repeatedly and conclusively that nothing is permanent. Brian came back from the dead. The lessons Peter learns in sincere episodes are forgotten by the following week. The growth that characters appear to achieve in special emotional episodes does not survive the reset button. The reset button is always there and is always eventually pressed. This is partly a structural reality of the long-running comedy format. Serialized change is not compatible with indefinite continuation. Characters have to remain available in roughly their established configurations, because the comedy is built on those configurations, and changing them fundamentally would require a different show. But Family Guy pushes harder against its own stasis than most shows, goes further into apparent permanent change. generates more emotional investment in story developments that look like they will stick before reverting. The experience of watching the show across its full run is the experience of repeatedly having apparent permanence undone, which is disorienting in the specific way that repeatedly broken promises are disorienting. The biggest mystery, and this is the one that cannot be answered by any document or interview or piece of historical research, is what the show has been trying to say for the last 15 years. The early seasons had a specific identity and a specific point of view. The humor was sharp enough and the character work was grounded enough that the show felt like it was coming from somewhere, that it had something it was trying to express. The later seasons are harder to characterize in those terms. They produce episodes, some are good, some are not. But the sense of creative urgency, of a show that knows what it wants to do and is doing it, has been largely absent for a long time. MacFarlane has described the show's continued existence in recent interviews primarily in terms of financial utility and audience demand rather than creative passion. The show keeps going because people still watch it, because it is cheap to produce, because it generates revenue from reruns and streaming and merchandise, because the business case for continuing to make it is clear even when the creative case is less so. This is honest, and it is probably the most accurate description of what Family Guy is at this point in its history. A show that continues to exist for reasons that have more to do with the economics of television than with any burning desire on the part of its creator to keep making it. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons through the 2028 to 2029 television year, in a deal with its parent company Disney. Each of those seasons would consist of 15 episodes. The show would reach its 30th anniversary still in production, still airing, still generating content. None of this renewal was contingent on the show being particularly good, or on its creator having specific stories he wanted to tell, or on the evidence of ratings which had been declining for years, and by the time of the renewal had fallen to a fraction of the levels the show had reached in its peak years. The show would continue because it could, because the economics supported it, because Family Guy, whatever it had become, was still a viable product in the entertainment marketplace. This is not a failure in any narrow commercial sense. It is simply the distance between why Family Guy was created and why it continues. The characters who were once alive are now devices. The world that felt real once is now a set. The family that used to love each other, underneath everything, has been replaced by a group of people who seem mostly to be performing the roles they were assigned at the beginning. The comedy that used to surprise you has settled into patterns. The jokes that used to push past comfort have found their own new comfort zone in shock and excess. And somewhere in that history, in the specific warmth of those first 3 seasons, in the relationship between a baby who planned to rule the world and a dog who could hear him making those plans, in the marriage of a man who meant well despite being wrong about nearly everything, and the woman who loved him for reasons that were always more complicated than the show had time to explain, somewhere in that history is the thing that made 22 million people watch the show's debut and made people buy the DVDs when it was canceled, and made adults drive to conventions to celebrate it years after it had gone off the air. That thing is still there, if you go back far enough and look hard enough. The mystery of Family Guy is why, with all that talent, all that history, all that accumulated trust from an audience that really did love what the show was at its best, the people in charge of it eventually chose to keep making it rather than to keep making it good. Those are 2 different choices. Family Guy made one of them. And the record of what it chose is everything we have covered tonight. The banned episodes, the pulled scenes, the character transformations, the real-world collisions, the near deaths and the actual deaths and the resurrections, the questions that will never be answered, the absences that will never be filled. All of it is Family Guy. All of it is part of what it means to have made something that lasted this long, in this world, for this audience. The golden years are still there. They always will be. And the distance between those years and where the show is now is not a mystery. It is a record of choices. Specific choices made by specific people over specific seasons that added up to something nobody planned and very few people wanted, but that almost everyone watched anyway, because the habit of watching was stronger than the disappointment of what had been lost. That is the final mystery, and it is one that every long-running show that stops being what it was has to answer for itself. Family Guy answered it the only way it knew how, by continuing. By producing another episode, and another, long after the original reason for making them had given way to simpler reasons. And by leaving behind, in the archive of its history, everything we have talked about tonight as a record of what television is and what it does, and how the most beloved things can become the most complicated things, one season at a time. Thank you for being here. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is where you are, I hope this was worth your evening. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the journey. Drop a comment with your location and what you thought or with anything I missed. Sleep well. Until next time. Bonus section. The episodes that almost were pitches, near misses, and the stories Family Guy was too afraid to tell. There is a version of Family Guy that does not exist. It exists in the form of pitches that were written, discussed, and shelved. In the form of scripts that went through 1 or 2 drafts before someone further up the chain decided the risk was too high or the reward was too low. In the form of interviews where writers and producers mentioned something in passing, a storyline they were developing, a character arc they had intended, a place the show was heading before it changed direction. These near misses are some of the most interesting parts of the Family Guy story. They tell you what the people making the show were thinking about. They tell you where the creative ambitions were pointing before the practical concerns arrived and turned the compass towards safer ground. There was, for several years, a version of the show that intended to give Stewie Griffin a coming-out storyline. This has been confirmed in various forms across multiple interviews. Seth MacFarlane discussed it as late as 2012, when he told Playboy that there was a plan in the early seasons to reveal Stewie as definitively gay, to take all of the subtext that had accumulated across a decade of episodes and formalize it into an actual narrative moment. The plan was not simply a reveal. It was going to be a genuine character development, something that aged into the show gradually rather than arriving as a punchline. The episode was discussed in the writer's room. According to people close to the production, it went through at least one formal pitch phase. The structural questions were real ones. How do you reveal something like that in a show that does not have continuity? Do you make it a special episode that stands apart from the regular format, something the audience comes to with a different set of expectations? Do you embed it inside a regular episode and let it arrive as naturally as anything on the show arrives? Do you play it for laughs, or do you resist that impulse and let it breathe as something more honest? None of these questions got answered because the episode never happened. What stopped it is more interesting than what would have been in it. MacFarlane has given different versions of the reason over the years. In some interviews, he suggested that the ambiguity of Stewie's character had become valuable, that not knowing was more generative as a creative engine than knowing would be. In others, he acknowledged more directly that the network had concerns. Fox was supportive of Family Guy in many ways, but also conscious of its audience demographics, which skewed toward a particular part of the American viewing public that was not, in 2005 or 2006 or 2007, uniformly enthusiastic about a major animated character having a coming-out arc. The calculation was probably not cynical in the straightforward sense. It was a risk assessment, the kind that gets made all the time in network television, and in this particular case, the assessment came down against doing the thing. The episode stayed unwritten. Stewie stayed ambiguous, and the ambiguity calcified over time into the permanent condition that we now understand as simply the way Stewie is a character defined by indeterminacy, by the space between what he says and what the show is willing to confirm about what he means. What would have happened if the episode had been made? There's no way to know. It might have been something genuinely significant, a major animated show handling a character's sexuality with seriousness at a time when that was not yet common. It might have been handled clumsily, in a way that disappointed everyone who had been waiting for it. It might have done both simultaneously, which is what ambitious television often does when it tries something for the first time. The important thing is that the space it would have occupied is still empty. The episode did not happen. The decision was made. And then the decision was made permanent by the years that followed it, and now the question of what Stewie is will probably never be answered on the show itself. The ambiguity has become the answer. There were other near misses. A Meg-centered episode that would have followed her through a week at school in a realistic way, not played for comedy, not framed as a joke at her expense, but presented as a genuine portrait of what that experience felt like from the inside was discussed, and then quietly dropped. The concept had support in the writer's room but ran into a structural problem that plagues every attempt to do something genuinely different with Meg. Her suffering is so deeply embedded in the show's identity that any attempt to treat it seriously feels like it is undermining something the show cannot afford to lose. Meg being miserable is a load-bearing wall. Removing it, even for a single episode, risks destabilizing the architecture of the whole. There was an episode planned in the wake of the 2016 election that would have engaged directly with political polarization, not in the way the show engages with politics ordinarily, which is through rapid-fire jokes that move too fast for any single point of view to land with full weight, but in a more sustained way that would have tried to dramatize what it felt like to live inside a divided country. This one was apparently written. Whether it was written in a form ready to produce or whether it was more of an extended outline is unclear from the public record, but there are interviews in which writers described working on material in that territory. It did not air. The show continued making political jokes in its usual way, but the sustained engagement with the emotional reality of the division, which was what the planned episode was apparently trying to do, never materialized. These absences accumulate over time into a kind of negative portrait of the show. The Family Guy that doesn't exist is, in some ways, a more interesting and ambitious show than The Family Guy that does. It is a show that would have done the Stewie coming out episode, and the serious Meg episode, and the sustained political drama, and probably several other things that got as far as the discussion phase before the practical concerns arrived and redirected the energy. The show that exists made different choices. It made them repeatedly, over many years, in many different circumstances, and the accumulated effect of those choices is what Family Guy is. This is not a criticism, exactly. It is an observation. Every show is defined as much by what it chose not to do as by what it chose to do. The episodes that didn't get made are part of the story. The pitches that were shelved are part of the record. And in Family Guy's case, the gap between what the show was capable of and what it chose to be is wide enough and documented enough that it becomes something worth understanding on its own terms. The show had ambitions it did not fulfill. It had opportunities it did not take. It had creative directions it pointed toward and then, for reasons that were always somewhat complicated and never entirely cynical, turned away from. And it continued making television that was sometimes very funny, sometimes genuinely moving, sometimes irritating and exhausting and repetitive, but always, unmistakably, itself. Extended reflection. What reruns? Remember? There is something specific that happens when you encounter a Family Guy episode from the first 3 seasons now, in the streaming era, after everything that followed. The show looks different when you know what came after it. The characters have a quality that the later seasons cannot quite replicate, a kind of earnestness underneath the irreverence, an emotional sincerity that coexists with the jokes rather than being sacrificed to them. Stewie in those early episodes is genuinely threatening in a way that is also genuinely funny. The joke is not just that a baby is trying to kill his mother. The joke is that he is doing it with real dedication, with real planning, with a real emotional investment in the project. There is something in that which lands differently than the Stewie who emerged later, the one defined less by murderous ambition and more by his relationship with Brian, by his cultural references, by his increasingly self-aware comedic persona. Brian, in those early seasons, is a genuinely complicated character. A dog who believes he is better than his circumstances and is probably wrong, but is trying anyway. His alcoholism is played as something real. His writing aspirations are played as something real. His relationships are played as something real. The later seasons did not entirely abandon those qualities, but they diluted them in ways that made Brian feel less like a character and more like a delivery mechanism for a particular kind of joke. Peter is perhaps the most transformed character across the show's run. In the early seasons, his stupidity is affectionate. It is the stupidity of someone who means well and keeps getting things wrong, who loves his family in a clumsy and real way, and whose failures have a human scale. The later seasons made Peter's stupidity cartoonish in a different register, larger, more aggressive, more disconnected from the emotional core that made his early characterization work. He became a joke about a stupid person rather than a person who happened to be the subject of jokes about stupidity. The distinction sounds subtle, but it matters when you sit with it. Lois in the early seasons is a woman with actual history. She has a wealthy background she has chosen to leave behind. She has opinions about her life that are not always resolved in Peter's favor. She has moments of genuine frustration with her circumstances that are not played purely for comedy. The later seasons compressed her into a more familiar sitcom wife-shaped supportive, reactive, occasionally given her own storyline but usually returned to her position in Peter's orbit by the episode's end. What the reruns remember is that these characters were once richer than they became. Not unrecognizably richer, you can trace the continuity. You can see how the later versions grew from the earlier ones. But richer, more specific, more emotionally available. The reruns remember a version of the show that was willing to let its characters be complicated, and that complexity is what made the early seasons feel like something worth investing in. The streaming era has done something interesting to Family Guy's legacy. It has made all of the episodes available simultaneously, which means that someone coming to the show fresh can watch the early seasons and the later seasons in quick succession and feel the shift in a way that was harder to feel when the show was airing weekly over 2 decades. The comparison is built into the experience now. You can watch the show that earned the cultural significance and then watch the show that inherited it. And the distance between those two things is visible in a way it was not when you had to wait. This is not unique to Family Guy. Every long-running show has the same problem in the streaming era. The archive is complete and accessible, which means the decline is documented and accessible, which means the reverence and the disappointment are available at the same time, in the same library, for the same monthly subscription. The audience gets to hold both versions simultaneously in a way that previous generations of television viewers did not. What Family Guy's archive holds is one of the more complicated legacies in American animated television. There is enough in those early seasons to justify the reverence. There is enough in the middle and later seasons to justify the disappointment. And there is enough in the banned episodes and pulled scenes and shelved storylines and ongoing controversies to justify the fascination. The show made something indelible. It made it twice, once in the original run and once in the comeback. It made something flawed and ambitious and frequently wrong and occasionally genuinely great. It made television that was talked about, argued about, complained about, and celebrated across more than 20 years of American cultural life. That is a significant thing to have made. Not a perfect thing, not an uncomplicated thing, but a significant one. And the story of what it made, including everything that was banned, cut, pulled, shelved, or never produced at all, is the story of what television looks like when it is alive. When it is responding to its moment. When it is trying to figure out what it is allowed to say and discovering that the answer changes depending on who is asking and when, Family Guy never entirely figured out the answer. That might be the most honest thing you can say about it. It kept asking the question across 20-plus seasons and several countries' worth of broadcast decisions, and dozens of controversies, and one genuine cancellation, and one genuine resurrection, and more cutaway gags than anyone has ever successfully counted. It kept asking and it kept getting partial answers and it kept producing more television anyway, because that is what television does, and because there was always another season ordered, and because the audience was still there, watching, in locations and at times that the show could not predict and its creators could not control. The audience is still there. You are part of that audience. You found this, at whatever hour it is where you are, and you stayed with it through everything that was covered tonight. That staying is its own kind of record. That attention is its own kind of tribute to what the show was and what it became and what it still is. After all of this time and all of these seasons and all of these controversies that did not stop it, Family Guy is still airing. The archive is still growing. The questions that were asked in the beginning have not all been answered. And somewhere in there, in the gap between what the show was supposed to be and what it turned out to be, is the thing that keeps people watching and keeps people arguing and keeps people coming back to the banned episodes and the pulled scenes and the mysteries that were never resolved, looking for something they can point to and say, that is the show, that is what it was, that is why it mattered. Sleep well. It was worth talking about. A final word, the persistence of the uncomfortable cartoon. Animation has always been a format that people underestimate. There is a persistent assumption, particularly in American culture, that cartoons are for children, that the drawn line and the bright color and the simplified face signal a kind of content that does not need to be taken seriously, that operates in a register below the threshold of genuine cultural concern. Family Guy spent 20 years proving that assumption wrong, sometimes gracefully and sometimes in ways that created real-world damage, but always insistently, always refusing the comfortable diminishment of being considered merely a cartoon. The banned episodes are the clearest evidence of this. You do not ban something that doesn't matter. You do not pull an episode from the air in response to a national tragedy if the episode is just a cartoon that nobody takes seriously. The fact that Family Guy episodes have been banned in multiple countries, pulled from streaming platforms, kept off American television entirely, and used as case studies in university media ethics courses is evidence that the show consistently operated in the zone where things matter, where what is said, and how it is said, and when it is said, has consequences that extend beyond the screen. That is a remarkable thing for a show about a talking dog and a murderous baby, and a man who regularly injures himself for the amusement of people watching at home. The show earned that consequence by being genuinely funny, first. The humor is what purchased the attention, and the attention is what gave the show the ability to cause real effects in the world. A show that was not funny would not have had 20 million viewers at its peak. A show without 20 million viewers at its peak would not have had the platform to get banned by the BBC and pulled by Fox, and criticized by GLAAD, and screened in domestic violence centers, and implicated in conspiracy theories about terrorist attacks. The comedy was the engine. The consequences were the road it drove on. What Family Guy ultimately represents in the history of American television is a question about the relationship between entertainment and responsibility, about whether a show that is primarily in the business of making people laugh can also be held to the standard we hold things that are primarily in the business of making people think. The show itself never quite decided which category it was in. Its best moments suggested it was capable of being both. Its worst moments suggested it had decided that being neither was also an option. The honest answer is probably that Family Guy was always all of these things simultaneously, to different viewers, in different episodes, in different cultural moments. What a show means is not fixed. It is a moving target, shaped by who is watching and when, and with what knowledge of what came before, and what is happening in the world outside the screen. Family Guy was always changing because the world it was commenting on was always changing, and the people watching it were always changing, and the people making it were always changing, and the network airing it had interests that changed along with the market. That is television. That is what television is, when it lasts long enough and matters enough to leave a record. It is not a fixed object, it is a process. Family Guy is still that process, still in production, still airing, still generating new seasons and new controversies, and new moments that will eventually join the long archive of things the show chose to do, and things the show chose not to do, things it got right, and things it got badly wrong, things it was brave about, and things it retreated from at the last moment. The banned episodes will stay banned, or stay available on platforms that have decided to make them available, or return to availability as the cultural context shifts, and what once seemed too dangerous comes to seem merely historical. The mysteries will stay unresolved, because some of them are unresolvable by design, and others are unresolvable because the people who could resolve them have chosen not to. The show will continue until it doesn't, and when it ends, the archive will close, and what was made will be what was made, permanent and complicated and impossible to reduce to a single judgment. Until then, there are always more episodes. There is always another season. There is always another character who will behave in a way that nobody expected, or that everybody expected, or that only the writers expected and the audience found baffling, or that the audience found perfectly natural and the critics found irresponsible. There is always more Family Guy. For better and worse, in ways that are sometimes very hard to separate, there is always more. And somewhere in that more is the reason people keep watching. Not because it is perfect, but because it is alive. Not because it always gets things right, but because it is always, in its way, trying. The trying is what keeps it interesting. The trying is what makes the banned episodes matter, and the mysteries linger, and the questions accumulate faster than the answers. That is the show. That is all of it. As much as it can be understood. And now you know it a little better than you did before tonight. Rest now. The mysteries can wait until morning.